Hello everyone. This is the first part of a commentary on the video game Elden Ring, developed by FromSoftware and released on February 25th, 2022 on Xbox and PlayStation consoles, as well as the PC. This first part will cover 2 playthroughs of the experience up to the conclusion of Stormveil Castle. In this commentary, I will be talking about Elden Ring in terms of its gameplay, its relation to FromSoftware's previous games, occasionally its lore, and other thematic elements I happen to come across as I think of them. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. This is a commentary, which means that it is not a walkthrough. Several aspects of this gameplay footage will be edited down to what I need in order to explicate what I have to say. Not only will you see some very subpar fighting, as I am an average player, but you won't see me speaking in depth about strategies of fighting in combat, unless it pertains to something about gameplay I'd like to discuss in general. Equally, I am not VaatiVidya, and will not talk in depth about the lore of Elden Ring unless I find it interesting to the task at hand. Instead, I would like to spend my time more focused on Elden Ring as a game, its strengths and weaknesses. If you are listening to this commentary, you might already know the state of the game from fans and critics. Elden Ring had universal acclaim immediately upon release, and then a minor backlash from fans of the series. I myself am rather torn. A big goal of mine in this commentary is to reevaluate the game for myself, to determine what worked and what did not, and to bring that knowledge to you. As the opening crawl for the game plays out, you should know what my perspective is on the story of FromSoftware games going forward. Much of my life has been spent more concerned with tone and atmosphere. I am still impressed that Dark Souls and Elden Ring's universes have as much world building as they do already, but the closer I have gotten to understanding them completely, the more I lose interest. As such, I try to maintain what I like to think of as a minimum safe distance, so as to keep my appetite whetted. I did spend a good amount of time before this commentary on doing some preliminary work, watching Vaati's videos, and reading through some of the item descriptions and whatnot, but you should consider me far from an expert. That being said, I do consider myself a fairly literate and well-read person, and I like to bring myself to the world of Elden Ring in terms of story and lore that I hope you'll find surprising. What I found surprising about this cinematic upon repeat playthroughs is that we do not really hear about the enemies we will be encountering in the opening crawl. Typically, we are foreshadowed to bosses we are about to fight. Rather, we gain some context from the world, and we are introduced rather to NPCs in the game we have a chance of interacting with. This brings the world closer to the historical Canterbury tales or to King Arthur myths, largely because those include an ensemble cast, each with a desire either to reach a certain destination or claim a certain totem, like the Holy Grail. I do not know what else to say beyond this, but it's an interesting distinction. Something else I can mention is that although Marika is introduced, she is a being who we will never see, at least not in this corporeal form. Marika's existence, saint-like and in old, decrepit churches, has obvious comparisons and iconography to Christianity, particularly in the way Marika poses with her arms outstretched. Her absence in the story is profoundly important in order to address a void or absence in the way the world functions. I do not intend to overtly speak towards religion throughout this commentary, but in my mind FromSoftware has leaned in on these kinds of religious details in the past, most notably in Dark Souls 3 with the Cathedral of the Deep. If we were to see Marika in Elden Ring exactly as she was shown in cutscene or as constructed throughout the world, I think it would have been a massive setback. Elden Ring, like the Dark Souls games, is built around a pastoral, medieval, ternary society. That means an aristocracy or a monarchy, as well as lords and ladies, perhaps warriors and shamans, and a large peasant class. So it is natural that these games flirt with the idea of a clergy, as devout belief was a central component. The player is told to cross the fog to the lands between. A veteran player has spent quite a bit of time crossing fog in FromSoftware games, and in that regard, wherever these lands are, this is no different. I had heard at one point, I don't remember where, that Elden Ring represents what people in the 1980s thought video gaming would be like decades from then, and I have to agree. Elden Ring has the kind of Dungeons and Dragons-like atmosphere, particularly in the aesthetic design, but it also harkens to several aspects of fantasy and mythology that we have come to see. Elden Ring begins like a military campaign, where we begin in Limgrave, effectively a temperate land in spring. Liurnia of the Lakes represents a wet summer, while Lindell is the world in autumn, with colored leaves. Finally, the mountaintop of the giants is a winter wasteland, where we ascend to gain knowledge. We are given, therefore, the feeling of going off on a big adventure, and the world of the lands between knowingly does work to make us feel intuitively that same feeling. What is unprecedented in the FromSoftware lineup is how truly open Elden Ring turned out to be. In previous games, though players could embark in more than one pathway, with some of the games more narrow than others, Elden Ring has a short series of recommended steps, but afterward a player may find themselves overwhelmed by the possibilities. It is the Dungeons & Dragons ideal of emergent storytelling, raised to the breaking point of FromSoftware's design. Many players found themselves turned off by this amount of choice, due to wanting a more curated and directed design. You are probably wondering how I intend to take my characters through this game. For the purposes of this commentary, I intend to do 2 playthroughs. The most robust playthrough is what I would consider to be a canonical playthrough, with the Vagabond as my choice of origin. With this character, I will be using the Elden Ring guide, released by Future Press, as the pathway from one objective to the next. This playthrough will not be a 100% completionist playthrough, but I think it will be representative of what perhaps FromSoftware wanted from a player when encountering their game. At a bird's eye view, I found the choice of the Vagabond, a strength build, and the movement through the game according to the Future Press pathway to be an ideal option when trying to find my sweet spot in difficulty throughout the game. With the Vagabond, I will be doing a standard ending to the game. In my second playthrough, you're going to see a magic astrologer build in contrast to the Vagabond build, an intelligence build that will be far more curated towards only the essential aspects of what the magic character needs. Because this is an intelligence-based character, to me it made sense to have this character complete the Age of Stars ending, which corresponds to Ranni the Witch. One of the benefits of Elden Ring, and several FromSoftware games in general, is in its variety to make and maintain a character. This was one of the key selling points from the developers when marketing Elden Ring before release. I happen to think they succeeded. Even though the question of balance might have been compromised on release, and though the question of dominant strategies still comes up now and again, this has been true for all the games, going back to Pyromancy and Dark Souls. I think that it is inevitable for some playstyles to be better than others, particularly in a game like Elden Ring, where so many options are available to the player once they complete the initial tutorial events. Though a player is more than welcome to see these play out online and through social media, what matters more to the player is the feeling of inhabiting different character types. And I think here in part 1, so far, you will see that succeed. The Chapel of Anticipation is the area a player starts in, one that is made off-limits after a fight with the Grafted Scion. Much like the Asylum Demon in Dark Souls, a player can be rewarded with a weapon, the Ornamental Straightsword. Ironically, unlike the Demon Greathammer in Dark Souls, the Ornamental Straightsword is one of the lightest weapons for its reach, weighing in at just 3 units. Its Ashes of War providing holy damage could be great against certain enemies, notably skeletons, as undead enemies do not fare well against holy damage. For a beginner player, or even a player like me, the Grafted Scion presents a steep and difficult fight. For players who chose the Samurai origin, they are given some better tools to fight the Grafted Scion, which makes for a much easier fight. Whether the player wins or loses, they are transported to a tutorial area that functions, much like the Undead Asylum, or the Things Betwixt from Dark Souls 2, as a tutorial area. For our Vagabond player, dropping down into the stranded Graveyard and Cave of Knowledge helps to introduce us to the larger moveset that is included, as well as some new additions. Many make their return, of course. The Souls games function on a stamina system for character actions that has been revolutionary for the gaming medium at large. When a Souls-like game comes out, one of the key features of that game will likely be this stamina system. Not all of them are created equal, however, and FromSoftware has been a master at balancing each of the weapons and skills in terms of how much stamina is used when performing an action. In Elden Ring, time will tell whether the game managed to combine the use of the stamina system with the enemies that the player will face. Also returning is a lock-on camera system and sense of weight to weapons. Unlike action games which feature button combos, Elden Ring is a big game that functions more on timing and positioning, and the camera is a big part of that. Lock-on cameras have been present ever since games went into 3 dimensions, with The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time likely being the first time I had ever seen it used. For Elden Ring, many of the enemies the player is likely to encounter have been made bigger and badder than before, so the camera system will see some strain in attempting to provide transparent information to the player as they go along. Characters can roll to dodge enemy attacks. There are light, medium, and heavy rolls. In Elden Ring, a player is heavily encouraged to stay within the medium roll range, which is between a 30% to 70% weight on equipment. Weapons and armor that a player has equipped takes weight, and the heavier these items are, and the lower a player's endurance skill, the heavier the player is, and so the slower their roll. What is fascinating is the lack of difference in iframes. Invincibility frames occur when a player dodges through an attack at just the right moment, thereby negating the damage the enemy would have done to them. The more frames, the wider the gap is to allow for a dodge that negates this damage. There is no difference in the amount of iframes for both a light roll and a medium roll. While the light roll is substantially faster, not including more iframes to incentivize a lighter armor play is, to me, a misstep. As such, few players opt for a light armor set unless it is incidental to their playstyle in other ways. On my Vagabond character, due to wielding a sword and a halberd, and due to heavier armor, you will see me fat roll. New to the Soul series is sneaking. By crouching, a player may sneak around so as to avoid detection. Backstabs make a return in the Souls games and provide an excellent pathway to damage while maintaining safety, as a player is invincible while performing the animation. Backstabbing has often been an overpowered strategy, and while it seems to offer less of a bonus to players, and though it seems to be somewhat more difficult to achieve, you will see me use it throughout the playthrough. Sneaking in general in Elden Ring may have been an initial strategy for players, but no one can sneak around all the bosses, and so sneaking is something to be dabbled into for any character, but not embraced for the totality of a playthrough. A player can block incoming attacks with a shield. Some shields block all damage, but not all, and so the choice to use a shield is not a straightforward one. Some shields provide less of a punishment to one's stamina meter, due to a guard boost mechanic. There are some shields which allow parrying, a mechanic that allows a player to counter an enemy attack if timed correctly, leaving an opening for dealing a critical blow. As I have not practiced the art of parrying throughout the years, you will not see me use this, but blocking for my Vagabond will come and go, and will have more to do with the weapon composition I have throughout this commentary series. New to the Soul series is a discrete jump button. Borrowing from Sekiro, much like sneaking, the player has been given a chance to jump, something that did not happen all that often in previous games. In Dark Souls, a player would need to get a running start in order to perform a jump, awkwardly tapping the B or circle button again in order to initiate the jump. Now a jump can be performed at any time, which has huge implications not just for combat, but for level design. The verticality of much of the spaces in Elden Ring benefit largely from this jump. The combat of Elden Ring does not have such a straightforward benefit. Given that the game wanted jumping to be a big deal, it should come as no surprise that it becomes an overdetermined strategy in Elden Ring, with players holding a weapon in each hand and diving into the enemy with a jump attack, spamming it over and over. You will see me do so on a number of occasions. There is just no getting around its effectiveness. Jumping attacks are fast enough to be done repetitively, do not cost as much stamina as I think they ought to be, and have a wonderful amount of damage tacked on. Not only that, but an enemy's poise is heavily afflicted as icing on the cake. Enemies now feature a finisher mechanic more often, where once a player receives a heavy sound cue, they can go to a certain spot or to a glowing spot to initiate an event, similar to a backstab, for a great deal more damage. There's just no getting around it. Jump attacks are a dominant strategy. There are plenty of other features that have been introduced or made more robust. Status effects abound, thanks to a variety of enemies, locations, items, and Ashes of War. Ashes of War were introduced in Dark Souls 3, but have achieved their final form here. Weapons come with a skill, which can be activated at the pull of a trigger. With only so many buttons on a controller, FromSoftware needed a way to make their game far more complex, and to do so they needed to leverage context based on a weapon the player was holding. Ashes of War are really great, and while some are greater than others, each has a use case to make an enemy far more manageable. Even in the guide, however, Future Press has provided a set of Ashes of War that stand out above the crowd. Like I said, with so many options, a player is left to answer for themselves what kind of experience they would like to have with Elden Ring. It is a trade-off, and a player is also left with wondering if this is an acceptable part of design. Much of the split between the fanbase over Elden Ring occurred here. How much open-world design is too much? To me, the question is best answered in implications elsewhere, and I look forward to showcasing that as we go along. Players earn runes, what used to be souls, for the purpose of leveling up their character into several stats. These stats affect a player's ability to attack, defend, use certain pieces of equipment, and by and large engage with certain parts of the world. Stats are also the way the game allows players to create diverse characters. An interesting point to make about Elden Ring is the difference in required souls per level. The curve of the amount of souls, or runes, has largely been the same throughout the games, but with Elden Ring, a schism happens between Dark Souls and Elden Ring right at about level 40, where suddenly Elden Ring requires slightly less runes than Dark Souls did souls in order to level up. Between level 1 and level 120, the difference in total runes it takes to level between the games totals up to around 80,000. Why this difference exists, I'm not sure, but I speculate that it was designed to help players earn those stat points so as to complete their builds before the final sections of the game. According to the game progress route over at Fextra Life, they recommend that levels 1 through 40 take place largely in the areas we will see in part 1 of this commentary. Liurnia of the Lakes has a recommended level of 40. By the time a player can use a Larva tier with Renala so as to re-roll their stats, a player has had a wealth of experiences and could make adjustments with their new stats as needed. It's difficult to be sure on, largely because I have not compared the amount of runes that enemies drop, so it will remain an ambiguous question. Though in raw graphical force, Elden Ring does not rely so much on textures, its use of color and art style combine to make the lands between one of the most jaw-dropping open worlds to date. Whatever the effectiveness of the worlds in FromSoftware games, we have to concede that each one has a distinct style that makes for some rather beautiful compositions, with perhaps the exception of Dark Souls 2 for its rather flat look. In this first part of the Elden Ring commentary, I'm going to speak about Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula, Siofra River, and Stormveil. We should probably give a general geographic overview of the lands we'll be discussing today, as many of the cuts and edits will likely atomize the experience of seeing the lands between in its cohesive intention. When we arrive in Limgrave, we are in the west. Further still west, we can see a couple smaller islands, one new, but another, far northwest, we can see where we begin. The northern fortress which imposes its walls upon the rest of Limgrave is Stormveil, where Godric the Grafted rules with force. Several terraces of land, Stormhill, separate our entrance from Stormveil, and weather leading to the fortress is covered with wind and low visibility. In the middle of Limgrave is Agiel Lake, which looked to be used for several smaller encampments, as ruins dot the landscape. Still further east is a declination into watery and swampy valleys, but far to the east the elevation picks up slightly, and we see vegetation slowly give way to a wasteland. Below these swamps is a forest the locals call the Mistwood, where one of the two minor Erd trees of this major area can be found. On an eastern peninsula is the first fort, a likely defense of the eastern shores against invaders, in this case Fort Height. The overall weather of Limgrave is temperate, spring, calm. As we cross a small body of water separating Limgrave, we enter the Weeping Peninsula, a slightly more humid and sea-lashed island. The center of the Weeping Peninsula is home to more forest, but we see a far more craggy verticality between low and high points. The main road takes us to the southern defense point of the lands between, Castle Morn, where we can see smoke rising from its battlements. Between these major points, the Weeping Peninsula reveals again ruins, shacks, old churches, and open expanses where wildlife have continued on between what look to be the undead in anthropomorphic form, or decomposed bodies that wander monstrously across the landscape. Though Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula may have once been peaceful, its inhabitants scarily contrast that claim. Rumors reveal another land, one deep below these lands, that are twice as beautiful and twice as deadly, but we will have to wait for our vagabond to stumble across them. The beginning required actions of a player are rather awkward in Elden Ring. After speaking with White Mask Vare, who acts as a sort of crestfallen warrior for the expedition he provides, the player should visit the Church of Ella, where they will encounter their first merchant, Kale, and purchase a crafting kit. Then a player needs to go to the Gatefront Ruins, where Melina, a player's maiden, introduces herself formally and offers the player Torrent, a spectral steed. Interestingly, it is implied that Torrent had a player before the player. Frustratingly, a player is expected to go back from the Gatefront Ruins to the Church of Ella once again. The game attempts to make this movement back more obvious. One is that there is an anvil at the church where a player can improve their weapons until they meet the smith at the Round Table Hold. Another is the presence of a high-level enemy nearby. Players may leave, explore the world, and remember to come back to fight the Tree Sentinel, one of the harder overworld bosses in Limgrave. I still think that, overall, the progression of features in this first area is quite poor. To be sure, the Soul series exists in a post-internet world, where there are hardly any sources of logic for why Rena might appear at the Church of Ella, or why Melina might give Torrent to the player at Gatefront Ruins. Elden Ring could have expanded the tutorial area to be a place where all of these items could have been given before the adventure had officially begun. FromSoftware attempted to provide an adventure guide, as well as some introductory update notes on Steam, so as to alleviate this problem. But, in my mind, the best experience for a player of Elden Ring occurs long after many of the early fans have discovered every aspect of the gameplay in the world. There might be a narrative reason for Rena to appear at the church, but still I think that the sacrifice of Rena being at, for example, the Stormveil shack, while Roderica could have been at the Church of Ella, with so many options for exploration, a player's last choice would be to go precisely where they have just come from. Players rest, retreat, or fast travel to Sites of Grace. You have likely already seen me activate several up to this point. In the past, there was a great deal of debate in the 2010s about open worlds and fast travel. Elden Ring's world is so vast that it largely makes this debate moot. Who would ever advocate for a playthrough without torrent, or without fast travel? In the case of the Round Table Hold, like Demon Souls or like Dark Souls 3, the hub world is not connected to the overworld. One of the most impressive aspects of Dark Souls to me, when I played it in 2013, was that the game could be largely played without loading times. Coming off of a game like Skyrim, where loading times exist in each change of scenery, and it was a nice touch for a game to technically know where a player was likely to be. Elden Ring still holds much of that promise, but the question of pacing between Sites of Grace has been relegated to larger dungeons, known as Legacy Dungeons. These are the spaces that veterans of the game are more familiar with. In the overworld, here in the open area, we find Sites of Grace everywhere. The ability to fast travel might have seemed obvious, given the size of the world, but the existence of fast travel reveals a certain big difference about the game. Limgrave, our first area, contains 3 churches, 3 shacks, 5 caves, 3 catacombs, 2 everjails, 5 ruins, 1 tunnel, and an assortment of other locations, giving us a total of 38 Sites of Grace. With 22 boss battles, the larger question is, okay, so in Elden Ring, we have a massive series of locations that repeat. So at what point do we decide whether the repetition of certain locations, enemies, or bosses is too much repetition? One interesting aspect of the Souls series is in how repetition is used throughout the series. An early boss in Dark Souls, like the Capra Demon or the Taurus Demon, may be used as a normal enemy later on. So it is no surprise how, even after a decade, FromSoftware still maintains a certain level of repetition, only here it has been stretched much farther than ever before. That being said, many locations in Elden Ring are not mandatory areas, but instead are optional. No one denies that the sense of scale in the game is huge. Like many reviewers said, it just keeps going, not just out, but down, deeper and deeper, all the way to the Lake of Rot. While Limgrave appeals to the player because of the originality of all these new assets and designs, we will be forced to admit the diminishing returns as we go along. As we see our vagabond move back and forth to take care of preliminary duties, we can transition over to our second playthrough with our astrologer mage character. She represents a player's second and more knowledgeable playthrough of Elden Ring. Coltina, as we'll call her, likely views the world of the Lands Between with the same skepticism and rebellious attitude as Ranni, which is why you will see our astrologer attempt to complete the Age of Stars ending. Our vagabond fits the mold of an ignorant and dutiful tarnished, called back as a supplicant, fulfilling the challenge simply because that is what he has been told to do. Compared to the vagabond, our astrologer will not be exploring the majority of the Lands Between, but will simply be maximizing the power Elden Ring offers with a minimum of effort. After the astrologer fails to defeat the Grafted Scion, there is no reason for her to go through a tutorial, but will instead go immediately to Limgrave. Our astrologer will have to perform similar functions in order to acquire Torrent, as well as meet Ranni and receive the Spirit Summoning Bell. From there, it's off to, of all places, Caelid. Rinna is a character who provides us with the Spirit Calling Bell, and represents to the player a contrasting maiden of the dark. With a bell, players can call upon spirits to aid them in battle. There is quite a debate about the use of spirits, in much the same way as people seem to have a problem with summoning. We should try and develop as best we can an analysis for the strengths and weaknesses of spirit summoning from our perspective as we go along. I do agree that summoning makes Elden Ring occasionally too easy, while not summoning can sometimes make the game irrationally harder. Unlike a game like Monster Hunter, enemy bosses in Elden Ring are not accustomed to fighting multiple enemies, so we have to concede that spirit summons can dilute the overall power and effectiveness of a boss fight. That being said, there are occasions where a boss fight takes place in an ensemble, where it seems like summoning is not only allowed but encouraged. I'll see if I can specify as we go along which ones are better than others. I am not for or against Spirit Ashes. I am more for a contingent use of them. A player may want to start out with maximum difficulty, but over time they can slowly add more to their wheelhouse against a boss in the event that they are tired of fighting it repeatedly. But I should also suggest here that I am for the most part done with the feeling of boss encounters in Souls games, so you will see me use spirit summons. A long time ago, I was interested in the game for its world, not its combat. As a result, I have rarely, if ever, received the dopamine hit from defeating a boss in FromSoftware games. Next up we have the Gatefront Ruins, which is an interestingly designed area largely for its geometry. As a space where a player is not guaranteed to have Torrent, it presents plenty of line-of-sight breaks to make a stealth approach possible. There are far too many enemies at the player's level for a full-on attack, so another aspect of Gatefront Ruins that's important is in the way it might teach a player when to fight and when to flee, as well as how to apply some newly acquired Spirit Ashes. Our first enemy location underground takes us to Groveside Cave. Holding only wolves and then a weaker final boss, the Beastman of Farum Azula, it's nice to be foreshadowed this enemy so far in advance. I had completely forgotten I had even fought this enemy in my first playthrough. This boss fits rather well in this cloistered cave setting. Both the boss and the player have room to maneuver. This is something I will not say about all bosses as we go along. The first talisman that we receive is a talisman that helps to weaken incoming fire damage. Talismans are passive objects a player can collect that, when worn, can sometimes encourage a certain playstyle. and return visits to Elden Ring. If a player is not obsessed with story, a player may ride all over the lands between, finding certain items that he or she may feel fits their player character. A player can wear up to 4, provided they have earned the pouches that are required, which are given for killing specific boss enemies. As a whole, Groveside Cave is an excellent introduction to some aspects of smaller dungeons. There are drops, there is darkness, and the enemies can surprise the player, or the player can surprise them. None of the enemies are too difficult, so although the tension in these dark spaces is quite high, it's a good start for a beginner player. What also might help a new beginning player is a new feature. Elden Ring has the Stakes of Marika. In previous games, if a player fought a boss and the player died, they would return to the world at the last bonfire checkpoint. In Elden Ring, that would be a site of grace, but in many of these larger tombs, that will lead to a long run back to the boss, which could prove frustrating if the player had to fight a boss over and over again. A Stake of Marika allows a player to spawn wherever that object is placed, which is typically much closer to the boss location. This makes repeated fights a lot more manageable. Stakes of Marika are an easy inclusion into a game which wants to make its boss fights harder, so that they do not have to compromise on their vision of creating intense and difficult and high-spectacle boss fights. Our next stop is southeast, to Limgrave Tunnels. This is an especially important place for a new character because it contains 7 smithing stones at the first level, a smithing stone at the second level, and a somber smithing stone. These are the materials that a player uses to upgrade their weapons. Since Dark Souls 3, players do not upgrade their armor, which I think was a good decision so as to assist the developers into fine-tuning the balance of enemies with a better understanding of what armor a player is likely to have at any given point, and what armor they are likely to have in the future. Weapons, on the other hand, have gone from a possible 15 levels in upgrading to 25 levels. This massive jump likely came from the length of Elden Ring as a game. Dark Souls takes on average 40 hours, while Elden Ring apparently takes 54. That being said, I'm hard-pressed to find many friends who manage to complete their first playthrough in 54 hours. Regardless, all players will obsess over finding smithing stones. The situation was so bad for early players that FromSoftware eventually made balance changes and added more opportunities to find smithing stones in the early game. This is also necessary, I think, so as to help the player experiment with much more weapons. Here you will see me use the halberd, but over time I will switch to several other weapons. Upgrade materials are typically easier to come by, but only to a point. The final most important upgrade piece, like a Titanite slab from the first Dark Souls, was a limited item, so one had to think carefully before that final use. Because of the toughness of these miners, running through the tunnels is advised over fighting for our vagabond. The Stone Digger Troll at the end is one such boss that strains not only the room they are placed in, but the camera system. As I replayed the game, I found a surprising number of enemies that do this, and so I felt like I should remark upon it each time. Because of the camera only showing a limited subsection of the boss's body, and because this is a traditional boss and not some gimmick, what you're likely to see is me trading damage with these bigger enemies. When I mean trading, I mean that I will damage the enemy while they damage me. I cannot really predict when these enemies will attack, nor where they will strike, so the end result of these fights is, though novel, occasionally awkward. We are rewarded with a Roar Medallion, a bespoke but nonetheless interesting talisman. The Limgrave tunnels present a very important location for many characters, including our astrologer, despite the fact that her introductory weapon will not be capable of being upgraded. That's right. The reason she is heading off to Caelid is to acquire 2 important pieces. First is the Meteorite Staff, which offers an S-tier scaling for intelligence, as well as bonus damage from gravity-based spells. The second piece is a gravity spell, called Rocksling, which will mostly be used as a heavier spell, but more importantly will be used against Renala, the demigod of Liurnia of the Lakes. For now, the Meteorite Staff is simply too good to ignore, not only because of its scaling, but also, strangely enough, because it cannot be upgraded. To upgrade weapons costs precious runes, and for our early characters, those runes could be spent upgrading our character instead. One of the greatest aspects of Souls games is their economizing. Runes are experience, yes, but they are also a form of currency. and knowing what to spend where is just another part of learning how to play the game. In previous games, upgrading weapons alongside armor left a lot of choices, but the heights to which a weapon could be upgraded was far shorter. In Elden Ring, the risk of taking a weapon far into the game, only to switch to another, means a lot of runes possibly spent on upgrade materials, and the labor from Smithmaster Hugh to upgrade them. The meteorite staff, and the lack of an option to upgrade armor, not to mention a lacking need to buy any crafting books, means that the astrologer can maximize the runes acquired, specifically for the character. Elden Ring has a day-night system, and some enemies can appear at different times throughout the cycle. I honestly expected this to be a much more common occurrence. Oftentimes, basic enemies are traded out for others. Here, we see the first of many of the Knight's Cavalry. Like many mounted enemies, its moveset feels bizarrely similar to others. That is likely because the options while an enemy is on a horse must have been stifling to programmers. The Knight Cavalry does have a separate health bar between the rider and the horse, much like the player does with Torrent, and this is likely the first boss the player comes across that will be fought with Torrent. I suppose now is a good time to mention that Torrent in its totality. I think Torrent, even after the hundreds of hours I've played, represents a responsive but no less awkward use for combat. For traversal, I can understand the appeal. Torrent is simply a zippier and more agile version of our own movement, though he does use a double jump, and he can use various magical air columns to get rapidly up and down the lands between. As such, for traversal, he is a required component in order to experience everything in the lands between. Fighting on horseback while shooting bows is incredibly awkward, as Torrent's speed is a little too fast for a player to hover around an enemy. Fighting with spells feels similar. The vast majority of bosses in the game are not fought with Torrent at the player's side, and I think that is for good reason. One would have imagined the Elden Beast or the Ancestor Spirit to be two likely candidates, given their size and the size of the arena, but that would come to naught. Torrent's role in the story is one of functionality, and its large function is to get the player across the huge expanses that sometimes lie in between sites of grace. There are quite a lot of ambushes, both in the open world and in legacy dungeons. Here at Stormgate, there is a troll and a series of Godric soldiers and foot soldiers blocking your path. Here, in my opinion, should the player choose to fight, it is an excellent use case for Spirit Ashes. There are multiple types of enemies, both ranged and melee, and there is a centerpiece, large enemy in the form of a troll. And they all present discrete challenges to the player in isolation, but in aggregate, and especially with the tight geometry made even more so by barricades, it can be frustrating. A player can choose either to run or to fight. Running through is easy enough, though a player may lose out on precious runes early on in the game, so summoning ashes can be a great way to withhold fighting certain enemies until taking care of others. Here both types of players win out. The veteran player chooses difficulty later by running through without earning runes, and the newer player comes to terms with Elden Ring's systems while benefiting from fighting. The use of stacked enemies to slow down the player while on Torrent will be nothing new. Here the scenario is a little more curated, with a giant up above waiting to drop down. A keen eye can help the player, which is a skill that has become less and less a contributing one to the Souls games overall. Here we encounter one of the many shacks in Elden Ring, though they are made novel with NPC encounters in some of them. One of those is the Stormveil shack where we encounter Roderica as the Heartbroken Maiden. Roderica informs the player of grafting, a particular theme not just to Limgrave, Margit, and Godric, but to the entirety of the game. I said I would attempt to provide some idiosyncratic interpretations for this commentary in regards to the lore, or story, or making of Elden Ring, and this I hope is one of them. I think that grafting, the idea of taking parts from others and fusing it or mending it with oneself, can be an established theme for what Elden Ring turned out to be. Anybody who has played Souls games before can recognize the crabs that linger out in Agheel Lake as the same ones from Dark Souls 3, and a veteran player may also recognize the repeated uses of certain enemy behaviors, layered over with a different look, such as the Erd Tree avatars bearing a strange resemblance to asylum demons. When reviewers talked about Elden Ring being the culmination of everything FromSoftware had done up to that point, It was just as much a figurative definition as it was a literal one. I believe that the theme of grafting exists as an insecurity to the makers of Elden Ring, a way of sublimating what they believe to be the molding of their style of game into something so amalgamated that it, perhaps, comes off to them as grotesque. Many early adopters of the Souls series can find plenty to be upset about in Elden Ring. FromSoftware has placed their originality into other intellectual properties like Sekiro, Bloodborne, and, perhaps, Armored Core when it returns. Elden Ring has elements of many of these games, though perhaps without the tightness and coherence as the games that came before. Elden Ring proceeds, therefore, as a zombie-like, undead advancement of all of their previous systems, into a form that, yes, looks pretty, but in a morbid way. I think the logic is sound. Artists put their insecurities metaphorically into their work. How could they not? Turning east instead of up towards Stormveil, we have the War Master's Shack, where Bernal heroically offers the player the chance to purchase some Ashes of War. At night, this is the first location where a player is attacked by the Bell-Bearing Hunter, an enemy that I will hold off fighting until later. It appears at night, and fights with an interesting telekinetic ability to throw and retract his sword like some kind of Jedi with a lightsaber. I found fighting him to be tense and gripping in the first encounter. Less so, as will be so often the case with this game, with later appearances.
Hello? Can you hear me? Help me. I'm stuck. Hello? Hello?
In our adventure, we meet with Iron Fist Alexander, who seems to have gotten himself stuck. A mixture of the Onion Knight from the Dark Souls games, and perhaps Winnie the Pooh, Iron Fist Alexander is a charismatic fellow due to his warm voice, his boisterous spirit, and his tubby roundness. The design of the paw near where his face would be bears some facial resemblances, and the lack of a mouth is great for FromSoftware, as they do not have to worry about the details of moving mouths. For those unacquainted with the series, this might be hard to internalize, but mouths in the FromSoftware series often have not moved when characters speak. In the Blue Point remake of Demon's Souls from the PlayStation 5, this trend was reversed, and here in Elden Ring it seems as though there is a minimum viable amount of mouth movement during character dialogue. AAA games seem to exist in a sort of singularity over time, where I suppose the desires of an audience to all have their games be the same open-world formula, I suppose makes a company squeamish about having NPC characters who do not have mouths move. I think it is totally unnecessary for a third-person game like Elden Ring, where distance from their faces justifies this kind of experience. FromSoftware games have always managed to create a form of video game that can cut away any extraneous fat that may impede from the most essential functions of their games and add to development time unnecessarily. Iron Fist Alexander, much like the Onion Knight, is one such method. He wants you to get him unstuck, and a heavy weapon ought to do it. From Bernal, we head northeast to the death-touched catacombs. Thanks to the Future Press guide, the vagabond will be given a slow and steady climb, not to mention a chance to run into several NPCs to begin their quest lines. But for many first-time players going in blind, Elden Ring is quite different than other Souls games for the chance to wade into areas either too easy or too difficult. Here in Death-Touched Catacombs, the player is likely to encounter skeletons for the first time. Skeletons, as undead creatures, revive if they are not put down after losing their health. There are some weapons in the game that deny skeletons this ability, ones that namely have holy damage, which is a common world-building feature of the fantasy genre. Against a strength character like the Vagabond, the Death-Touched Catacombs stands little chance. This is also true for the boss of this arena, the Black Knife Assassin. Here, bizarrely, the boss starts with only 60% of its health, and here I also summon Spirit Ashes, which in my mind was a mistake. The assassin is easily stun-locked, meaning that it has a low poise, and many attacks will prevent the assassin from making an action. I find it interesting how, even with this curated journey provided by an in-depth guide, much of the tuning of difficulty can still suffer. Now that it is not to say that it would always be the case. A magic user in these catacombs may find themselves suffering. That is a story we will interpret as we go along. Here also we encounter Grave Glovewort, an upgrade material for Spirit Ashes, and Deathroot, an item used in quests tied to Hunter D, as well as the beast clergyman Gurranq. We receive a talisman as a reward. Speaking of Hunter D, we encounter him before Summonwater Village. Out of all the NPCs in the game, D is one of the most stylish. His armor is truly inspiring, and the voice that he brings alongside it is relishing. Souls games are ones where I find the voice acting to be truly superb, and it comes just as much from the immediate power of the actor or actress as from the sound mixing in their environment. In the past, listening to a character speak in a voice barely above a whisper, and to have that voice echo in the tunnel of a cave, or in the vastness of the New Londo ruins, is so deeply haunting that few games can match that energy. Here, D is warning you of the haunting of a village by a Tibia mariner. Unfortunately, this boss does not quite match D's energy, and there is a striking and hilarious contrast when the player ends up fighting an enemy who uses a boat to strike the player. At a distance, the existence of Tibia feels fairly novel, with his magenta glow over the still waters. This mariner offers yet another death route. Earning it has D sends you to a port gate close to the Third Church of America, which is where we want to go anyway. Before leaving, players are highly encouraged to pick up the green turtle talisman, a benefit to any build, due to the importance of stamina use in the game. For some unknown reason, the Third Church of America happens to be the one that contains the Flask of Wondrous Physic. Like so many other tools at the player's disposal, these locations seem random. The flask is a reusable bottle that can be loaded with 2 tiers, each of which provides a certain bonus to the player. When a player drinks the flask, these benefits are provided for a short time, making them ideal for boss fights. The amount of items available to the player, and their locations, to me symbolizes a trade-off. In repeat playthroughs of Elden Ring, a player would be mad to avoid going to this location. But with that logic, the same holds true for any number of other item pickups, such as golden seeds, sacred tears, smithing stones, grave gloveworts, specialty weapons and armor, and so on. Now, we should also concede that these items are indeed optional for the player. But now the developers have a strange conundrum. Do they design boss fights with the least amount of these items in mind? An average amount? Or most? One compelling aspect of Souls games have been their variable difficulty. This is all done diegetically. A veteran player will skip more enemies out on the field, which means there is a chance for the player to fight certain bosses at a lower level. This may also be the case too for item pickups, where a veteran player may decide to get them later, or may choose to avoid them entirely. A beginner player is encouraged, on the other hand, to be insatiably curious and thorough in Elden Ring, but this risks tedium. A veteran player is encouraged to be efficient, which could mean exploiting the game. And the developers of Elden Ring, it seems to me, wanted these leveraging tools in order to create the highest spectacle fights from bosses that we have seen to date. This had knock-on mechanical effects, which we will come to, but it also presented some options that, in repeat playthroughs, a player felt they could not avoid. It seems as though there are some sites of grace that lie outside of Limgrave and Weeping Peninsula that do not affect NPC quests. Journeying so far out to meet the Beast Clergyman appears to be one such site of grace. I am not sure how I feel about this. On the one hand, in moments where a player can see the map stretched out to this alarming degree, the possibilities seem immense. This will occur again at a place called the Tower of Return, and can also occur in the Dragon-Burnt Ruins. On the other hand, I wonder why Gurranq couldn't have just rested nicely, perhaps between Limgrave and Caelid, or some other place within riding distance. If a player wanted to have as few load times as possible, so as to make the feeling of playing the game as adventurous and coherent as possible, these teleporting scenarios with their load times, to me really dig into the overall feel of the game. I do realize that is a bit of a stretch, as the prospect of seeing the sheer size of the world is too tempting to ignore. Still, there are moments where the game provides that with its geometry in much better ways, in my opinion. Before pillaging Fort Height, we first have to talk to Kenneth. The player encounters Kenneth stranded on an old piece of ruin overlooking the Mistwood. Kenneth Height is a blowhard, a person who believes himself to be of much greater importance than he actually is, but his work in finding a rightful heir to Limgrave intersects with Nepheli Loux, who we will encounter later and who happens to be Sir Gideon Ofnir's adopted daughter. So despite his haughtiness, he creates a real effect in the world. Kenneth's fort has been overrun by demi-humans. Similar to the repetitions between games, we see some similarities between locations, as this bears some resemblance to the Castle Morn narrative in the Weeping Peninsula. Demi-humans are an ugly slave type, with barely any rights. It is interesting that class is mentioned so heavily in Elden Ring, with gods, demigods, tarnished, and the demi-humans, and if I were to guess, I would suspect this, as well as the family dynamics between characters, as well as the Erd Tree, Golden Order, the Shattering, is all thanks to the inclusion of George R.R. Martin. Having played and seen more of the lore surrounding the game, I have started to see that, yes, Elden Ring is very reminiscent of Dark Souls. We have different ages, dragons and giants are involved, and the world we interact with now is in decay. But I think there are some hints that Martin's mark on the world is slightly more than we thought. At first, of course, many fans were dismissive of the game. What was there in Elden Ring that bore his mark? While I will say that his influence is minor, I think these moments of class dynamics breaking out would be one such moment. Another moment people have speculated on would be the Night of Black Knives, a consequential event discussed in the lore that occurs before the player arrives, and is an assassination of Godwyn the Golden. This is similar as a catalyst to something like the Archduke Franz Ferdinand leading to World War I, and it is the kind of historical knowledge that I think Martin would possess. It also has the sound of an event, much like Game of Thrones, like the Red Wedding, where something cataclysmic unexpectedly arrives that shocks the reader or viewer. I could be wrong on these things, of course. It's just a feeling. Both the Death-Touched and Stormfoot Catacombs have a whopping 5 Glovewort pickups at level 1 for the player. Going to both of these invites some redundancy, as does the boss of the area, the Watchdog. The Watchdog occurs 5 separate times in Elden Ring, and is one of those bosses that, in my own personal playthroughs, I like to avoid entirely. Not only does its moveset leave plenty to be desired, the attempts by the game to bolster the fight are often weak, with elemental effects or with simply including more enemies. If I was playing without Spirit Ashes, or if I had a particular build, most of the time I would avoid these 2 catacombs entirely. At some point in the journey, either through defeating Margit or from activating a Site of Grace outside of Limgrave, Melina will invite you to the Round Table Hold. She admits that she had some reticence in choosing you as a consort, but she can see now that the player has what it takes. Like we have mentioned before, a player has to physically fast travel to the hold, which is something I do not prefer. Effectively, what it means is that it is much harder for a player to complete the game without a minimum of load times. It has less to do with loading conceptually because, honestly, on an NVMe drive, the game virtually loads instantly. It has more to do with the continuity of the experience. In any case, when we are here, we encounter many NPCs, and I suspect this was done to make the hold feel like a gathering place. Many NPCs like Corrin, Dialos, and Hunter D do not become more prominent in their narratives until later in the game. In some cases, far later. To be sure, there are far more NPCs in the game than the original Dark Souls, which I love. If I had my way, Elden Ring would be a living game, where a consumer could pay for DLC that would periodically expand NPCs and their stories, filling the world more and more with a density of narratives overlaying each other, much like the worlds they build. To be honest, as much as I love this idea, I think it is wise for them not to do it, as I do not think it would justify the cost of labor and the return on investment. Sometimes I actually do see when my role as an armchair critic has gone too far. Still, a girl can dream. Scribe Corrin is described by the Future Press God as a fundamentalist believer in the Golden Order, and his passion will send him to Goldmask, a kind of saint among believers. A player can hand Corrin books of knowledge that he considers heretical, but that still provide the player with miracles both sacred and profane. We have met D, Hunter of the Dead, before. He too believes in the Golden Order, enough to wage his own crusade against death. D and Sorcerer Rogier have a kinship, and will have more to say when Rogier arrives after Stormveil. For now, his bringing the player into the fold with the Beast Clergyman is all we need. Dialos Hoslo is a strange quest indeed that will take some time to come to fruition. At the moment, he is looking for a servant girl named Lanya. At first glance, Dialos is the kind of handsome and well-dressed knight that may remind us of Sir Galahad from ancient Arthurian myth. It is not difficult to see the parallels between Arthurian influence and the Round Table Hold, but also with the larger aesthetic uplift from the Souls game's darker and more gothic underpinnings. Master Hugh is our smith, looking ravaged and pockmarked as he is, some misbegotten being. He serves the Golden Order dutifully, regardless of his personal beliefs. He has a history with spirit tuners, and this will come about once Roderica joins the player at the Round Table Hold. Fia, the deathbed companion, can be found behind Hugh. As souls do not die, they instead pass from one entity to the next, and it appears as though Fia is a person tasked with laying with the dead to assist in this process. Fia requests to hold you, which results in an intimate exchange not often seen in these games. The player is rewarded with a Baldekin's Blessing, which will actually lower a player's health until the item is used and thus removed from one's inventory. Fia's story intersects with several, especially Rogier, Ronnie, and Hunter D, so for the purposes of our astrologer character, we may find ourselves interacting with her extensively. We can encounter the bell-bearing maidens in another room, who can receive bell bearings in order to sell items that certain vendors would have sold had they been alive. Besides that, a player is likely to notice that many rooms are blocked off. Eventually, we will meet Sir Gideon Ofnir, a cross between King Arthur and Merlin, and his trusted security, Insha. Insha does not say a whole lot, but Gideon is talkative enough for the both of them. He heads the Round Table Hold, as well as gathering knowledge surrounding the Golden Order and the demigods who hold the final vestiges of power in the lands between. For now, that is who we see in the Round Table Hold, up to Stormveil. Before entering the coastal cave, we should probably discuss meeting Bach the Seamster for the first time. I never ended up meeting Bach in my first playthrough. I eventually found a needle to alter my garments, but I cannot recall where or when. Bach is hiding as a bush in the overworld, apparently tricked into it by someone or other. Bach can be found again at the coastal cave, and if you provide him with a sewing needle, he can follow you around throughout Liurnia up to Lindell. Adjusting garments involve tailoring them to be a slightly lower weight and lower protection, but may be just the right amount for a character to alter their roll speed from heavy to medium or medium to light. Personally, I never use this, and instead prefer to level up my endurance so as to fit into the garments well, so to speak. At the end of the coastal cave, a player does not simply return to the site of grace, like previous locations, but instead continues forth to the island that is the Church of Dragon Communion. Islands in open world games fascinate me, and in my first playthrough, one of the first things I attempted was to cross to the island on foot, resulting in one of my, if not my first death, one of my early deaths. The church harbors little beyond the ability to take the remains of a dragon, its heart, to the altar so as to perform communion with it and earn an ability. Dragons have been used in the Souls games to greater and worse effect over time, but one can find them everywhere. The same holds true for Elden Ring. In the open world, a dragon's existence makes much better sense in the space that it inhabits. Dragons need a lot of room to work with. That said, there has been a lot of criticism about dragon fights in Elden Ring. One criticism is how Torrent is basically required to fight the dragon, which I don't consider a problem necessarily. As an overworld boss with a lot of maneuverability, a player on a horse fighting the dragon has a sort of epic feel that is lost when a player is on foot, stabbing its toes. Dragons prove themselves to be highly resilient to most forms of damage except for stabbing, ironically, though it still has some resistance. Once again, fighting one dragon is nice, but fighting them over and over with slight changes to their abilities and elements makes them a bit tedious. Yet another set of ruins lies to the southeast, holding our strange teleporting chest, which I will not be using, as well as a twin blade and an ash of war. Each location attempts to add some novelty. One of the interesting facets of ruins that a player is likely to find is that some parts of the ruins are not accessible on foot, but have to be jumped by torrent instead. This won't be the case for all of them, but it does present a twist on the formula for ruins. That being said, it is not perfect, and over time a player will expect there to be places off limits in ruins, so the novelty, I suppose, wears off. Before going into Murkwater Cave, a player is likely to be invaded by Bloody Finger Norwegius, an NPC specializing in blood loss. Alone, the player may be overwhelmed, but during the fight, Yura will intervene on your behalf. Yura has a personal vendetta against the Bloody Fingers. Fingers, and their uses, as touching, as transmitting, is a particular leitmotif of Elden Ring. The two fingers act as emissaries to the Golden Order, and the Three Fingers acts as a sort of outcast who can usher players into the Lord of Frenzied Flame ending. Characters are touched by grace, and the finger reader Crone asks the player to touch her fingers. Why this leitmotif exists in Elden Ring is up for speculation. Patches makes a return in Elden Ring. For those unaware, Patches is a character seen in many of the Dark Souls games, and even Demon Souls. His role is to portray a trickster, like in various folktales. When the player encounters Patches, it is in the guise of a boss fight. Yet halfway through the fight, Patches will cower and beg for mercy. Killing him entirely nets you a bell bearing, which you can turn into an NPC at the Round Table Hold for the purposes of buying what he would have sold had he been alive. Killing him also nets you with a spear at a +7 upgrade tier, which is not a bad reward for a player like me, who has been using other weapons. Here, our honorable vagabond, who is seeking to be the Elden Lord with a righteous pilgrimage, will not be killing Patches, despite his trickery. Patches happens to sell an item that is useful against Margit, an item that can stop Margit for 3 seconds into the ground if it's used, but because it costs 5,000 runes, you will see me avoid such an item for its sheer cost. Further up the riverbed, we have the Murkwater Catacombs. Catacombs are often frustrating for their similarities. Their atonal and ominous voiced music hits at a high pitch that is irksome. Their layouts often attempt to maximize their space, as a player is meant to venture in so as to activate a lever which opens a door present back at the entrance. Here we'll encounter fire arrows as traps, as well as some gloveworts, where they fight against a Grave Warden duelist, who occurs twice in the game. Defeating gives you a banished Knight Ingval. Interestingly, this boss did not always drop these ashes, but dropped the battle hammer instead. This weapon has now been pushed to the royal capital. If I was asked why this exists, I would say that the weight and heft of the weapon prevented its use by many, but I would like to argue that my Vagabond Strength character could have benefited immensely from the damage and the strength scaling this early on in the experience. I suppose as we have received an update to the player versus player experience in Elden Ring as a free update close to the writing of this script, we should talk about the awkward continuation of patches that came out after Elden Ring's release. Some of these, like balance changes, are to be expected, but others, like the addition of some features of quest lines, and the changing of whole items like the battle hammer, strike me as bizarre. It seems that few games nowadays have settled into providing a product that is ready to hand right at release, save for those incredibly bespoke indie games developed by one person or a few. This most likely contributed to the future press guides for Elden Ring coming out almost a year later. Your perspective on how frustrating this is will likely depend on when you first played Elden Ring. For me, having played a release, the communal aspect of seeing the player base reach certain milestones, like the fight with Radahn, was enough to satiate my growing displeasure with certain elements being added in later. Still, it will be a point of contention as we move through the commentary. Later on, we have the High Road Cave. I quite like High Road Cave for its complexity and jumping from one place to another. Its use of water and the darkness creates this primordial atmosphere that helps to foreshadow later sections of the world as we ascend the Altus Plateau. Unfortunately, the Guardian Golem is an enemy we are going to see so often that the novelty of High Road Cave wears off in a second playthrough. The Blue Dancer Charm Talisman is the exact opposite of what our Vagabond needs to fight, so the reward is all for naught. This includes the Shamshir, a weapon more fit for quality or dexterity builds than for our Vagabond. The Waypoint Ruins matters little to our Vagabond hero, but matters quite a lot more to our Astrologer. She is on a quest for Ranni's favor, but equally she is in search of only the most efficient and effective means towards her magical path. Sorceress Selen is a heretic of sorts, cast out by the Academy for pushing the limits of acceptable magical research. You'll find her trapped by a mad pumpkinhead, a common and yet fearsome enemy, who goes down easily if the player knows its moveset. Sorceries that hit his helmet do less than his body, so Spirit Ashes are encouraged if only to be able to deal more damage to his exposed body when his attention is elsewhere. Freeing Selen allows sorceries and a progression towards the Comet Azure, a stupidly powerful spell, when used in the right circumstances. With a dramatic darkening of scenery and a change of character from our Vagabond to our Astrologer, we encounter the Mistwood, a particular favorite location of mine, where we can also hear the howl of a wolf. Upon discussing this with Merchant Kale, of all people, we learn the finger snap gesture, which can conjure this moon howler to the ruins. When we do, we meet Blythe, a consort of sorts to Ronnie, and who we will get to know extensively if we decide to go down Ronnie's path. Blythe seems to have a vendetta of his own against a Knight Darrowil, and you can assist Blythe in fighting him later on your journey. In contrast to his design, Blythe's voice acting makes him seem like a warm and empathetic character, which is more tragic because of where his storyline takes him. Throughout the coverage of Elden Ring as people were playing, there was quite a lot of fun poked at the rune bears of the Mistwood as the true bosses of Limgrave. The bears represent an attempt by the developers to give the players new form of transit, torrent, something to fear. In repeat playthroughs, I have noticed that I have placed myself in far fewer corners against these, now that I know what to look out for, so this brief moment of tension is short-lived. But between the fog and the darkness, it is quite easy to stumble upon a bear in the Mistwood. Fort Height is home to a good source of blood rose, useful in crafting blood items. On top of all the other mechanics Elden Ring includes, it also includes a crafting system. Players can collect cookbooks throughout the world, mostly sold by merchants, for the purpose of making items to assist the player throughout the world. On my original playthrough, I found myself using pots and darts extensively in the first areas, as my character was a dexterity-based one. Over time, I dropped the crafting system for a bleed build instead. Fort Height is also home to a heavily armored Godric Knight that uses Blood Slash. It is a nasty enemy to fight long-term, so the player is incentivized to take down the Knight quickly before any blood loss occurs. Fort Height is also one of 2 locations to contain a Dectus medallion. These medallions are used to ascend to the Altus Plateau. The other can be found in Fort Ferreth, way off in Caelid's Dragon Barrow region. Elden Ring relies on a large swath of key items, both for NPC quests and for traversal. If I had my way, sometimes I'd rather have equipment that could dictate how a player moves throughout the world, much like an adventure game like the Zelda series, but I also understand why FromSoftware was vigilant about its openness at nearly all costs. Elden Ring is an action game first and foremost, not an adventure one, and knowing when to stay in one's lane is a sign of confidence from the developers. For example, the forlorn Hound Evergaol rests just off the beaten path as a player heads south. After hearing so much about Margit and the coverage from Game Informer weeks before release, I did not even attempt to fight Margit until heading south. Heading in the opposite direction of where a game wants you to go is not unheard of, and often leads to interesting Easter eggs or benefits to a player. The Evergaol to fight Darrowil might arrive before a player even encounters Blythe, who is in the Mistwood to the east. There is usually no barrier of entry to Evergaol's, but encountering Blythe requires interacting again with Merchant Kale, a very unintuitive link. In previous games, the benefits to a hub world linked diegetically to the overworld was that the developers would expect a player to return to the Firelink Shrine, but at specific nodal points. One obvious moment would be, in Dark Souls, when finding the notable shortcut elevator from the Undead Parish back to Firelink Shrine. After encouraging Lautrec imprisoned and setting him free, it would make sense to see him again at Firelink as he hungrily gazes at the Firekeeper. A player has a decision to make on the Firekeeper's behalf at that point. The lack of fast travel gave FromSoftware a better idea of where a player could go at any point and what barriers a player could cross that would progress an NPC questline. The open world of Elden Ring takes the problem of enemy difficulty and NPC stories and creates such a broad problem that Elden Ring almost requires some kind of guide. After defeating Darrowil, we will not see Blythe again for some time, at the Radon Festival, I suspect. So we are off to our next overworld boss, the Tree Sentinel. Once again, we see the Sentinel later as a normal enemy, which I think is fair given the unspecial and functional use of an enemy designed in this way. It is a badass version of an enemy, to use Borderlands lingo, rather than a boss, so it is a more palatable reuse, like demons in Dark Souls. Much of this fight feels familiar to the Knight's Cavalry or other fights on horseback. Even with a different moveset, the response from the player is largely the same, which involves orbiting the enemy and then lancing when there is downtime. Patient players get all the perks in Elden Ring, as enemy bosses seldom provide enough time for attacks. One of the things I wanted to mention at this moment is the backlash to Elden Ring's performance on launch. This Tree Sentinel fight was where some of the problematic performance intersected in an ugly way. There's quite a bit of density in Limgrave, what with the trees and weather effects. Not only that, but Elden Ring loads shaders and textures over time, resulting in better performance later, with the trade-off of quite a bit of hitching early on. This is a modern gaming problem, as many games have resorted to loading shaders and damaging performance on the early experience. Some games opt to preload shaders and menus, which you may have seen in recent Call of Duty games, or some other titles where developers are trying to manage expectations by trying to front-load the issue. We live in an environment where a player is expected to download a massive game, download a massive day one patch, and likely in the future preload assets. Getting a game for the holidays usually meant plugging it in and playing it. At the time of this commentary, not so much. I expect this will largely be solved in the future. Playing games from the past will be much faster, yes. And also there will likely be some sort of progress in loading and unloading assets, much like the improvement from hard drives to solid state drives, and then to NVMe, and so on and so forth. For now, we exist in a lands between, pun intended. Another overworld boss encounter at night is the Deathbird. This is one which occurs multiple times, even in our Part 1 commentary, both in Limgrave and in Weeping Peninsula. And we will, again, see this boss even later. The Deathbird is a bizarre enemy that I don't believe works very well on foot or on horseback. On horseback, the enemy does not present many attack points save for the feet and head, which the Deathbird can react to quickly, and when it does, it stuns Torrent horrendously and annoyingly. On foot, the Deathbird flies around erratically outside of camera ranges. It makes for a rather silly fight that I don't really believe proves anything. This is the case with a couple of bosses in Elden Ring, where we wonder what the player learns that is substantially different from what came before. Dark Souls was so new as a game, and a whole new genre, that it took time for players to generalize the combat against enemies and bosses. By Elden Ring, many veteran players have mastered combat again and again. What does a player learn from fighting the Deathbird? What does a player gain? Besides the obvious rewards, I'm not sure. I mentioned at the start of this commentary that this would be a commentary and not a guide. The Crucible Knight Evergaol is where I drew the line. I have a sordid history with this fight, as it was the first fight in my first playthrough that I banged my head against over and over again. I find this fight to be deeply unsatisfying for a couple of reasons. I suppose if I was a more adept player at parrying, the Crucible boss would be far easier. In this playthrough, I will be skipping the boss, and likely returning to it far later, to highlight the difficulty scaling discrepancy issue in Elden Ring a little bit more explicitly. Another location that I will be skipping is the Fringe Folk Hero's Grave, as I would rather spend those stoneward keys for other places. The hero graves of Elden Ring contain chariots that I believe are a pain in the ass. Returning to them later in the game does not, unfortunately, make these any easier, because if the chariots run into the player, they die instantly. I suspect this is a point of pride for the developers. Simply put, we do not necessarily need this area. Golden seeds are just as easily discovered in other zones, and we already have a banished knight in our possession for spirit ashes. Erdtree's favor is a great talisman, especially for our vagabond character, and especially when combined with a talisman like Radagon's Scar Seal. But I dislike this type of encounter too much to get that for the time being. It has been a while since we checked in on our astrologer. After her encounter with Sorceress Selin and Blythe, the half-wolf, there's really no larger obligation for her except to push the game forward. The only thing that is next is fighting Margit and pushing into Stormveil, so that we can meet Sorcerer Rogier. For now, she was going to start collecting, and this is as good a time as ever to speak towards Elden Ring's economic system in regards to consumables and upgrade items. The Lands Between is filled with items. Everywhere you look, there are things to pick up. Some of these items have no bearing on certain characters. What would our astrologer do with a halberd, for example? On the other hand, there are plenty of items which are universally beneficial. Golden seeds, sacred tears, and golden runes, to point to several. The question for our astrologer is not, like our vagabond, what would it take to experience the larger elements of Elden Ring? The question for her is, what would it take to move on in the game? This is a broad question, and the answer is not always grinding for runes. As we saw with the meteorite staff, collecting items from other locations is just as viable. As long as a player does not activate certain sites of grace, several NPC quest lines will remain intact. And if a player does not care about any quest lines, well then, almost every major area of the lands between is accessible. Our astrologer may not be so mad as to pursue this line of thought. While the astrologer has some skepticism about the current order of things with Queen Marika and her offspring, she does so within the confines of the argument given by the game. Other entities, like perhaps the Dung Eater and the Frenzied Flame, exist totally outside the logical scope of the rhetorical situation of Elden Ring. In that way, I'd like to keep our second playthrough a balance between the two extremes, a storied and narrative experience, but without breaking most of the mechanics of the game. With all that said, that still leaves Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula, Siofra River, and Stormveil to investigate. While our vagabond has torn his way through Limgrave, our astrologer will take a more knowledgeable approach. Elden Ring is willing to do this for you. Scattered around the world are golden runes. They are everywhere. The first level of golden runes even randomly appear scattered throughout, hidden in glowing skulls, and can reappear infinitely. By taking a cursory glance at the guide from Future Press, I have roughly calculated the amount of souls one can be expected to gain from each area. In Limgrave alone, simply in the overworld, a player can get over 20,000 runes. Golden runes 1 through 5 can all be found here, some even gathered close together in above-ground tombs or graveyards. Other runes are a little bit more troublesome to come by, but the promise of 1,200 runes for a single item, such as the Golden Rune 4 from Summonwater Village, is more than enough reason when you consider that giant crabs in Limgrave only give just over 300 runes, meaning a player would have to find and kill 4 of them just to match a single consumable item. Moving on to the Weeping Peninsula, a player can expect a little over 7,000 runes, which admittedly is not as great a haul, but when combined with Siofra River, which offers yet another 7,200 runes, then we can see the snowball effect. If a player chooses to collect all the runes from inside tombs, catacombs, graves, of both Limgrave and Weeping Peninsula, a player can gain another 9,000 runes. If we take the total from all of these runes scattered throughout the world up to Stormveil, we're looking at 43,200 runes. That is enough runes to take a level 1 player all the way up to level 26. That is a startling revelation. To be officially prepared for Liurnia of the Lakes, the recommendation is level 40, so that makes this collecting player short about 100,000 runes. When looking at the bosses for these areas, we can close that gap. A player stands to gain 12,000 runes from Margit, 13,000 runes from the Ancestor Spirit, and 16,000 runes from the Dragon Skin Soldier. That's another 41,000 runes. Killing Godric nets us another 20,000. That's 61,000. If a player were to use Godric's Remembrance, that would be another 20,000, bringing us to 81,000 total. If a player were to duplicate that Remembrance at the Weeping Mausoleum, and then consume that, it would be yet another 20,000 runes, bringing us to our much-needed total of 100,000 runes, and level 40, just in time for Liurnia. Think about that for a second. A player can effectively be prepared for Liurnia without stepping foot in any destination outside of the expected pathway after Stormveil, and be at level 40. Keep in mind some mitigating factors that may fluctuate this number. First, Stormveil houses golden runes as well, between 1s and 5s, that can add to our haul. Second, we're assuming a player is level 1, but many of the classes, to start with, begin slightly above level 1. Third is that a player may absolutely have to upgrade their weapons. These can cost in the thousands by the time a player is ready for Stormveil, but also keep in mind that, so early in the game, these are minimal compared to what we see later. Fourth, a player has the capacity to sell items. These do not necessarily net a great deal of runes, but it is still there as an option, if a desperate one. As the astrologer collects what she needs from Margit, we should speculate on what this means. I think it is obvious that FromSoftware did not expect many beginning players to be so thorough. After all, there are so many locations, and these higher number of golden runes are not in plain sight. The guide from Future Press did not arrive in the United States until November of 2022, months after the release, and the second volume is not expected until the end of March 2023, over a year later. Yet the internet has been able to bridge that gap rather well, so an introductory player, if they have decided not to go in blind, will have these runes at their fingertips. But in all likelihood, FromSoftware was hoping for players to encounter some of these runes along their path. Second, the proximity of that total number to level 40 feels eerily close. One wonders about the intention of FromSoftware to make this a plausible option. Returning players may not have wanted to fully explore, and the chance to only experience the best of what Elden Ring has to offer, quote-unquote, may be far more appealing to returning players. As such, a boss-only run would be ideal. If this is the case, we can't help but speculate on how the developers feel about the massive world they have created. I think a counter-argument could help here. Why didn't FromSoftware simply remove these golden runes and attach these runes to enemies with a higher overall rune count? Why is a Godric soldier only worth 67 runes? What we have is basically a trade. Instead of items in the overworld, we also have enemies. In both cases, a player might find themselves going out into the world to retrieve them. It's just one option involves combat. A player may do the math and realize that a certain group of enemies offer so many runes in such a close space that it becomes an area to grind. This is a problem with Mogwyn Palace for later in the game, but we'll come to that. In these early areas, we can then assume that exploration was more important than combat, when push came to shove. On the other hand, later areas suffer the same problems as these earlier ones. Liurnia is teeming with golden runes, and the average weight of them is far higher. Think about the difference between bonfires and Dark Souls. A player could absolutely run through certain locations, but all that meant was a very steep climb against the next boss, without the gained levels from combat to bolster their arsenal. In Elden Ring, a player can effectively dodge all intended combat encounters save for bosses, and still be left at the end just as ready as our thorough vagabond. I'm not really sure what to make of this realization. My intuition tells me that, at the end of the day, who cares? If a player wants to avoid tedious dungeon diving, or if a beginner player needs a leg up, why not provide that with just a little bit more exploring of the world? The open world is beautiful, so it is nice that the game offers such a rewarding incentive to traverse it. It is at this point in the game that Future Press believes a player is ready to take on Margit, the Fell Omen. So with that, we return to the castle gates and meet him. The arena to fight Margit in is a strange one. Like the twin gargoyles from Dark Souls 1, there is a precipice that the player can fall off of. Otherwise, it is a long, narrow pathway like the top of the church with the gargoyles as well. The truth be told, Margit's best comparison might be with the Taurus demon. He is the boss on the way to the other boss, and little narrative beats continue after Margit's death quite like Godric's. Margit's shackle, provided by patches, can incapacitate him. He has several weaknesses such as slash attacks, poison, rot, and bleed. This is similar to the Taurus demon, where the player is offered the chance to apply what they've learned with the Asylum demon by dropping onto the Taurus demon repeatedly. Even with the guide, this fight took me 3 times to tackle, because the first time I fell off the cliff, and the second time I died to repeated blows. I think this simply comes down to my low skill level, as well as my lack of patience, and not to any sort of problem necessarily from the game explicitly. Margit has been hailed as an excellent boss for providing equal opportunity, space in his attacks, and several avenues to defeat him. We will see Margit's form return, like so many others, in other bosses later down the road. After defeating Margit, the Future Press Guide recommends you to head towards the Divine Tower of Limgrave, which is a bizarre request given that you do not even have Godric's Great Rune, nor is it an easy path there from the main entrance to Stormveil. We will be tackling this later, obviously, when we explore Stormveil proper. Compared to our Vagabond, our Astrologer does just as well. It took me about as many tries as the Vagabond, but keep in mind that I defeated Margit in a fraction of the time it took to prepare for Margit with my Vagabond, meticulously exploring each location and defeating each enemy. With Greater Limgrave out of the way, it's time to head down to the Weeping Peninsula. This is where I found many of my best moments in the early game. While I was overwhelmed with Limgrave and intimidated and lost in Liurnia, Weeping Peninsula felt like a smaller and compact form of the open world, one that combined NPC quests, dynamic encounters, and strange hidden areas to give me back that Dark Souls atmosphere I crave so much. The geography has a great deal of verticality, with ramparts and castles bordering landscapes to accentuate the declinations. The Weeping Peninsula expertly weaves hidden locations between these plateaus, and I ended up missing several of these places on my first playthrough. If you haven't already guessed, I like Weeping Peninsula, and I liked it just as much when I was making this commentary. Soon after entering Weeping Peninsula, we encounter Irina, a blind daughter worried about her father at Castle Morn, which she reveals is in the middle of a servant uprising. She hands the player a letter to give to Castellan, who the player encounters later. That is not to say that it does not have its share of problems. After crossing the Bridge of Sacrifice, a change over into nighttime will have us facing our second Knight's Cavalry, only this time the overworld boss has the added bonus of a flail causing blood loss. The movements and fighting pattern is largely the same, so these distinctions do not provide enough of a difference. As we're entering deeper into the middle of this series of commentaries, we are going to have to come to terms with the amount of repetition. A naysayer may point to the fact that this fight is, again, an optional fight. But we also have to wonder whether these are equal points against each other, this repetition versus open world choice. The Weeping Peninsula is, by and large, a totally optional area. But inside this area, we have the presence of some novel enemies, though to be sure, we will see some overlap with other areas, most obviously this Night Cavalry and the Deathbird. Also consider that several places, like shacks and mages' rise towers, make an appearance here and will be seen later in other places. Even the Ailing Village, one of my favorites, has similarities to other locations later. Compare this to the painted world of Ariamis, which is one of the best areas of the first Dark Souls, and is totally hidden from the world were it not for a single doll found in our old jail cell and a large canvas in Anor Londo. We come across a location that majorly benefits our magic character, so she will need to come through here at some point for an easy memory stone, which increases a magic spell slot to carry more spells out in the world. While Elden Ring offers a huge amount of spells to collect, like Ashes of War, few of them end up being used. For our sorcerer, the Glintstone Pebble and the Rock Sling provide plenty of what we need for a very long time. Too long, really. So here with the Rise Towers, we encounter some light puzzle solving, much like the Artist Shacks, where we are required to scavenger hunt 3 ghost turtles. This took an embarrassingly long time for my Vagabond character. On playthroughs quickly after, however, this goes by so quickly that all it serves to be is a tedious aside. Many of the concepts of these repeatable locations are built slowly upon themselves as the player goes along. With the Impaler's Catacombs, we have a platform room that will raise and lower if the player touches it. The trick is to get underneath it. Besides that, the location suffers immensely from yet another burial watchdog boss, coupled with fanged imps fighting around it. I see no problem activating Spirit Ashes here, as the fight and the reward are all rather pointless. While we are on the topic of repetitions, one of the slowly gnawing feelings a player may have when playing Elden Ring is the monotonous feeling of exploring and clearing these dungeons. In Dark Souls, each encounter felt dramatically different, because of the wide variety of geometry, but also for the way enemies interacted with that geometry. In Elden Ring, besides some new technical pieces, few of these are dramatic differences in the way we feel about these areas. There will be a couple of exceptions as we go along, but Elden Ring, more than many of the other games, feels distinctly like a game first and foremost, and a depiction of a world second. Unlike in a game like, say, Elder Scrolls Morrowind, where many of the tombs and caves and grottos have some corresponding story or lore to bolster its context narratively. Here in Elden Ring, since so much of the game relies on graphics rather than text or audio or other clues, it's very difficult for a development team to provide the level of articulation and detail across all these locations. How many ambushing imps is it going to take before a player realizes that perhaps not every part of the world is bespoke and original? The Forest Lookout Tower is where we will pick up the Hand Ballista. It is a nice tool for our strength character as a way to pull enemies in specific moments. We will be doing so mostly in Stormveil, because we have a limited number of bolts. Earthbore Cave is a bizarrely difficult place to find, given what the player can find in it. There's a chest right at the beginning which can lure the player into a trap as the ground gives way, but here I avoid it. The Spelldrake Talisman is a pretty common type of item seen in the games, but it will be useful when making their way through Liurnia of the Lakes. One of the complicated problems with Souls games is how weapons, equipment, or talismans lose their effectiveness the further into the game one happens to get. This is because of the obvious fact that there is less game left for these items to have their usefulness. Elden Ring attempts to alleviate that with its open world. Any player who wants to play a certain way need only to make the attempt to ride out as far as they're willing to go to get a certain object. In our mage build, we did this with the meteorite staff, and since it was relatively close by, and outside, it was too tempting to pass up. But if a player needed an item from the Altus Plateau, for example, that is a much taller order. We have seen these bears before, but this bear has the added privilege of cloistering the player into a smaller arena. There is a small ledge which can make use against the boss, but otherwise it will be a claustrophobic affair. Madness is a new status ailment in Elden Ring, one that not a single boss falls prey to. As such, it is difficult to recommend on the player's behalf, but it can be a nice surprise against the player. The first time a player encounters madness is likely to be the ailing village. The glowing eyes from rats and soldiers is disconcerting, and the spells shooting out of soldiers and their eyes even more so. How madness interacts with the world is one of those ephemeral ones that even veteran players may be confused about by the time the game is over. Morn Tunnel represents a preamble to Castle Morn, and contains many of the misbegotten enemies, including a scaly misbegotten as a boss. It is a mine, so players are incentivized to come here for their smithing stones. A summer smithing stone can be found here as well, and also a golden rune at a level 4 nearby. Golden runes are items of runes that are collected and are therefore not lost on death, unlike the runes that are earned with killing. A 4th level golden rune rewards 1,200 runes, which is far higher than many enemies a player is likely to face in Limgrave or Weeping Peninsula. Even the first level of a golden rune gives 200 runes, so running after them and collecting them and dying is still okay, because you'll still be able to hold on to it even afterward. While we're on the subject of runes, we should also address the fact that it seems like our mage is playing on what appears to be a harder difficulty. Faster in Elden Ring immediately makes the game more difficult, because a player has less levels, and possibly less of a selection of equipment to fall back on. This is a kind of intuitive difficulty slider for Souls games, and I'm surprised players do not mention it more. Beginner players grind over and over again, get lost, and though they eventually put those souls into leveling, it takes more time to do so. A veteran player wants to dispense with the completionism of these games, and instead has in mind a certain build they would like to try. In the Souls games, less repeated movement through these levels means less souls overall, which means that they will be attempting bosses at a lower level. This is faster and harder, but players are better on their learning, compensating for their lower character level. Sometimes it works, other times it doesn't. We know that there exists a level 1 run for all of these games, so we know at rock bottom there is technically a way to circumvent nearly all of the legwork before boss fights. That being said, most of us do not perform well enough for a level 1 run of Elden Ring to be a reality, least of all me. So the task of each player on the first run or on subsequent runs is more like asking the question of what the player is willing to go through to prepare for the next boss. This is out of the question for our vagabond, for the hope is that following an in-depth guide and thoroughly exploring each location will prepare for a boss automatically and without grinding. But for the mage, the world is our oyster. Had our character not sauntered off to Caelid for the meteorite staff, the demi-human forest ruins presents a nice enough alternative with the Queen's staff. Unfortunately, it only provides a C level scaling with intelligence, rather than the S level for our staff. There's also an interesting shield, meaningless for our vagabond as well. That is all I have to say about these forest ruins. The Tombsward Catacombs contains a cookbook which allows players to craft rancor pots. There are an absurd amount of cookbooks in Elden Ring, and the ability to craft certain items is likely broken up to slowly dole out abilities to the player in a way that does not break the game along the intended path. But to have a cookbook only provide one item to craft is kind of hilarious to me. Maybe it shouldn't be a cookbook, and should have been like a note. In subsequent playthroughs, players are likely to pursue only the cookbooks they need, if at all. For my first playthrough in Elden Ring, I did use cookbook items early in the game, but eventually left them for equipment and certain leveling strategies. Tombsward Catacombs is also home to the Cemetery Shade, an enemy that is aggressive at a comedic level and has an appearance similar to the Kepper Demon back in Dark Souls 1. Killing the Shade gives the player the Lutal the Headless legendary Spirit Ash, which is one of the best in the game. Besides these features, and the use once again of fire traps, Tombsward Catacombs is strikingly unremarkable. A debilitating problem with these gamified locations continues to be a lack of lore anchored to them. For Lutal the Headless, she has the description, quote, "Spirit of a headless knight who leads the mausoleum soldiers, wields a lance enrobed in death and hurls spectral lances at foes. Lutal sacrificed her life so that in death she could continue to protect a soulless demigod until their revival, earning her the hero's honor of Erdtree burial." And as you can see, the catacombs do not provide a level of articulation to help embellish or extrapolate from this description. While the overworld of Elden Ring is artistically stunning, more dynamic in its weather, more beautiful in its foliage and natural look, and even more haunting in the cases where it appears unnatural, as we see in Caelid, it conversely has far less to say. The gap between the lore and the environment feels wider than previous games, which may have lent towards that feeling of confusion that many players had in trying to piece together Elden Ring's story, even more so than in previous games. We come across our first defended Erdtree, guarded by an Erdtree avatar, who share a close resemblance to Asylum demons from the first Dark Souls series. In my first playthrough, I had a distinct problem against these avatars, but have had far less of a problem in later runs. I suppose it likely has to do with reaching these at an appropriate level, but also there are quite a few ways to cheese these enemies. Cheesing in games means using a particular method for defeating a boss, using tactics that are thought of as unintended, or cheap, or dishonorable given the context of what the game intended. For example, in my first playthrough, I found a vantage point against the boss and shot arrows at it until it died. The avatar had only one way to fight this strategy, and the holy shards it throws at the player can be easily avoided from that height. The crystal tiers it provides offer some fairly substantial defense options for early players as a way to circumvent damage by careless mistakes, which is a very important item for these new players, so I feel the items are at least well placed. Here again at the Church of Pilgrimage, we have a church with a sacred tier. While there is some coherence when it comes to sacred tiers, where other items end up is not necessarily as certain, though the game does an admirable job of attempting to place items that mechanically seem to provide the right benefits at the right time for players as they progress through the game. The narrative rationale has gone out the window. In previous games, despite the fact that narrative followed gameplay and storytelling, the weapons or armor that appeared would be somewhat explainable in narrative form. This is another way of addressing the problem of space in Elden Ring, but from a different vantage point. Instead of repeating myself, we can move on, but in this church we can hear Melina talk about Queen Marika if we happen to rest at the site of grace, and see the prompt in the list of menu options at the site. For many players, simply grabbing these like they grab everything else in a great big scavenger hunt means that they may have missed this conversation entirely. A player can recover a winged scythe from the Tombsward ruins, but otherwise that might be the only remarkable feature about these. A player can spend between 30 seconds and maybe 2 minutes here, but nothing more. The scythe itself is interesting, but also unremarkable. In my mind, behind the forlorn hound Evergaol, the weeping Evergaol is the next easiest in our Part 1 playthrough. For my vagabond character, the chance of frostbite is mitigated by my endurance skill, which I have quite a lot of due to the weight of my equipment. Frostbite lowers a player's ability to fight off damage and recover stamina. For strength build, staggering him is rather easy. For any player with the ability to use fire damage, ancient hero Zamor is an easy win. Zamor drops Radagon's Scarseal, a very effective talisman that raises certain attributes which are perfect for our vagabond despite the added 10% damage taken. Near the Wandering Mausoleum, we have yet another Church of Marika, this time guarded by spectral headless soldiers. They can teleport in and out, sometimes near the player, which can be quite jarring. After collecting the sacred tear, there is hardly any reason to come back to this place, other than perhaps to use the Site of Grace for other locations, which we will discuss momentarily. The Tombsward Cave is hidden well for what it contains. For a poison build, the use of the cookbook found in here allows a player to craft 2 poison greases. Greases can be applied to most weapons, with a regular grease lasting much longer at 60 seconds, with less poison buildup, or a drawstring grease, which is shorter, 15 seconds, but has much higher buildup. The Viridian Amber Medallion, by killing Miranda, the Blighted Bloom, which is a glorified poisonous flower, raises maximum stamina. Besides that, I suppose the location could be a good place for collecting poison bloom and cave moss. In Elden Ring, materials harvested from the world can return, for the most part. In the case of rarer items, like Arteria leaves or smithing stones, this does not happen, but in the case of mushrooms, moss, or flowers, the answer is yes. The following location is also a great place to pick up poison bloom. Witchbane Ruins also hides a strange twist. It seems that sorceress Selene from Waypoint Ruins can be found here, trapped with her arms pierced and pinned to the wall. She is clearly suffering, but the reality of how she can be in one place and then another is a mystery that we will uncover soon enough. We come upon yet another merchant in a shack, only this time we will be purchasing a lantern that we can hook onto our clothing instead of the torch we have been using so often. It will not be for a long time before we buy another light source, only the rationale for buying it won't be light necessarily, but as a way to see enemies that are invisible. I will say for the moment that FromSoftware has always been fascinated with using light and dark in their environments extensively. Many of these locations are nearly pitch black without such devices. A long time ago, Dark Souls 2 attempted to make a game that relied heavily on light and dark, but the attempt seemed to have been abandoned halfway through, so many of the torches a player can light prove rather meaningless. In Elden Ring, it seems as though they have reached the ideal of how to use light, as a minor touch to certain locations, but not necessarily a theme for all of them. Because of the contrast of my monitor, you will see me turn the lantern on and off on rare occasions where there is not enough light for me. I suppose it makes sense to have the bottom and the top of the map linked in such a bizarre way as it is at the Tower River turn. At the top of the tower there is a chest that can teleport a player to Lindell, and regardless of if the player can defeat the golem guarding the port gate, they can receive a talisman by running to a chest if they can make it in time. I do admit that there was something shocking about teleporting so far north, as it suddenly dawned on me that the amount of progress I had made through Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula amounted to such a small part of the lands between. Something I did not consider, however, is that the ratio of novelty to land use is a diminishing one as the game goes on, not to mention that the density of locations dwindles as well, so the jaw-dropping moment here belies a hidden and darker truth about the rest of the game. Despite the fact that we do not have a remembrance, the Future Press Guide provides an explanation for taking down a mausoleum. When I first played, I had assumed that these mausoleums were simply window dressing for the game, and served no mechanical function. But later, of course, the player realizes that remembrances, the items left behind by key bosses after death, can be duplicated at mausoleums. This is likely because these remembrances can be turned in for legendary weapons and items in Elden Ring, and there are multiple options for what a remembrance can be traded for. Here the mausoleum needs to have the skeletons attached to its legs torn off of it. How many seems to be an ambiguous number, but once you do so, the sound of the bell stops, and its legs collapse, leaving the tomb above available to enter. I quite like the perennial sound of the bell, however. It adds an ominous presence to the world in its sound design. One aspect of Elden Ring that I have not yet discussed is the thorough use of music in the overworld. In previous FromSoftware games, music was used sparingly. Hub locations like Firelink Shrine used it, and bosses were likely to have them as well. I've always been impressed with these Souls games and their sound design in weapons, environments, and voice acting, particularly in their creating sounds that feel close to the context in which they sound out. The atmosphere that these sounds create has been nothing short of ASMR for me over the years, since I first played in 2013. The use of sparse music for overworlds, but also for Catacombs, is to me a mixed bag. I think first and foremost it reveals an insecurity in FromSoftware's approach to the open world compared to the previous titles. While the previous games were confident that a lack of music would help the player with learning important sound cues in the world, thus building an understanding of where enemies will arrive and what attacks they will use, Elden Ring has gaps where a player may not be doing anything of the kind, and instead is simply writing on torrent. Rather than, like the video game Shadow of the Colossus for example, lean into their open world design with previously established ideologies, FromSoftware instead acquiesced to what a typical player might expect in the open world genre. Eventually, I lowered the music dramatically in volume in my first playthrough, as the prospect of hearing the Catacombs music each time I went into one only reified the repetition that bogs down the Elden Ring experience. I do find many of the music pieces out in the overworld to be quite pleasant. That is not necessarily the issue. The issue is more their function, which seems simultaneously obvious for open world games and shocking for FromSoftware games. I was startled by the music. Its implications are larger than just with sound. Either Castle Morn or Stormveil are likely the two places a player will encounter first that feels resolutely like Dark Souls. Both of these locations feature set pieces, double backs, labyrinthine layers of pathways, shortcuts, verticality, and certain narrative events. They feature storied elements with NPCs embedded into the brickwork, going through their own problems. My early time with Castle Morn was really excellent. I enjoyed what I consider to be a dungeon, despite the Future Press guide relegating it to simply a location, for a couple of reasons. First, it has the typical fight towards a boss at the end, with a series of narrative conceits and NPC encounters which finally give Elden Ring a sense of place. As much as I adore Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula for their sheer graphical force, there is just something missing from huge swaths of the landscape that Stormveil and Castle Morn actively provide. Also, both of these locations hold together a string of sites of grace checkpoints which add tension to the player because they do not know where the next one is going to be, especially with the density of enemies at Castle Morn and the density of detail. These sites of grace highlight what made the Souls series wonderful in the first place, that sense of tension and then release. It is unlikely that a player will fast travel awkwardly out of Castle Morn and back in, so there is also a sense of narrative progress, the feeling as though we are going on a journey, a sort of adventurous arc or quest. When we arrive at Castle Morn, we find it to be in total disarray. They find it guarded by a golem, and the courtyard shows the misbegotten servants torturing and killing the bourgeoisie. A player can choose to sneak around the effigy, or they can attack it head-on. As they climb the ramparts, they find the remaining Godric soldiers fighting off the misbegotten slaves. The ramparts layer one over another, which allows multiple pathways through the middle of Castle Morn. The design of the middles of zones broaden wide and then taper at the beginning and end wonderfully, both in Morn and in Stormveil. As the player descends the back of Castle Morn, they find a variety of rooms and ladders, and can even drop onto the tops of towers. Eventually, the player returns to ground level. Throughout, the player can collect weapons and items and talismans. In my first playthrough, I briefly gave the whip a try even. Here with the Vagabond, the Claymore is a great pickup. Having used the Bastard Sword recently, the Claymore hits harder and swings faster, and the Claymore throughout the Souls series has been a staple, decent weapon, so it's one a strength character can likely trust for a while. Here our Vagabond is going to put that hand ballista we picked up to good work, using it to pull enemies from our group, as well as deal with enemies in the air. Our key weakness for our strength character is the near total lack of ranged attack options, which we will see brutally again in Stormveil. The Leonine Misbegotten boss fight was the first wall I hit in my first playthrough. Back then I had not discovered that Evergaols were interactable, and the relentless attacks of the boss made it difficult for me to counter. I think the most important aspect I wanted to bring up as our Vagabond fights this boss is the way that bosses will close distance to the player with an attack, regardless of space. This is something Matthew Matosis discusses in his God of War critique. Enemies, regardless of the space between themselves and the player, can attack and reach beyond what seemed possible for that attack. And yet, it lands close to the player anyway. In God of War, and in other adventure games like Batman Arkham Asylum, a player need only point in a direction and attack, and the game tries, sometimes to absurd and illogical degrees, to connect. Can Batman really tumble 50 meters in a single flip? Now, in Elden Ring, a static distance for attacks for the player is important for consistency. But with Leonai Misbegotten, his attacks veer much farther than what looks to make intuitive sense. His size and stature and his leap often do not add up in the physics of what the game provides. In previous boss fights, Elden Ring has relied on a couple of methods to keep the player within range. First, the arenas have been smaller. The underground caves, catacombs, tunnels, and tombs are all working towards a denser boss fight. Second, the enemies have been much larger, thus justifying a certain reach in their limbs or weapons. Some enemies can swing their weapons out much farther with chains attached, and some enemies can dash or teleport. All of these functionally serve to make the enemy a little bit more palatable to accept whenever danger heads towards the player. Leonine breaks that immersion. I think deep down that many bosses do this. It just happens to be that Leonine is the most obvious. By this point, however, with a vagabond at the level he is, Leonine just does not stand a chance, and a strength character can stagger the enemy, combined with the noble spirit ashes, and this boss fight is history. Coming back to Irina's father Edgar, we are able to free him to return to her, and the result is a tragic one. When we return to Irina's last known location, Castellan Edgar is looking over the dead body of his daughter and vows revenge. We have one more part of the Weeping Peninsula to discuss, and that is the next Deathbird fight. There really isn't much to say about this fight, except perhaps the awkward area that the player fights the Deathbird in. Not to mention, if the golem is still around, that it can shoot the player from its defensive post in front of Castle Morn. The same features still apply to the strangeness of these fights. One imagines that if this fight was not here at all, if it would have detracted all that much from the final product. And indeed, in my first playthrough, I never recall fighting the Deathbird here. It's strange. The Future Press Guide actually recommends that a player confront the beginning stage of the depths with the Siofra River before going to Stormveil. Why this is, I suspect, has to do with Siofra's openness as a dungeon compared to Stormveil, and likely Future Press did the math and saw that the Ancestor Spirit and Dragonskin Soldier, the two bosses of Siofra River, only have health in the 4,000s, while Godric has 6,000 health. Not only that, but venturing into Siofra does not break any major NPC quests, while Stormveil is the end of the first stage of Elden Ring. So with that preliminary statement out of the way, let's dive down. I do not think it is a stretch to say that the elevator down into Siofra will go down, literally, in history, as the pivotal moment for buy-in from players in Elden Ring. If players have seen the breadth of the lands between above ground, thanks to some hints from some teleporting trap chests, then the implications from this elevator ride down is one of shock and elation. There are moments in gaming which can so fill us with awe that we are rendered as children again for our brief moments of inexplicable delight or lack of understanding. These have recently occurred to me in games like Outer Wilds, Disco Elysium, The Witness, and now Elden Ring. Either this moment or the further moments underground was what did it. This is not a new or original statement. Most players have talked very highly of Siofra as a place to be discovered. I do not want to discredit that initial moment, so I thought it best to remark upon it here. Siofra's visuals and music present a similar aesthetic to The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, in the moment where the Fellowship encounters Lady Galadriel and the Wood Elves. It is a resonant, glowing, somber-colored bright night. Fortunately, the enemies here are different, and the spectral bowls guarding the place makes it feel like a defended tomb. The bowls that need to be lit so as to allow access to the Ancestor Spirit fight is a nice scavenger hunt that invites tension and anticipation towards it. It builds suspense. For those who did not watch coverage where the Elden Ring trailer blasted several seconds of the Ancestor Spirit prominently as flying around throwing magic everywhere, the reveal of the boss was likely a startling one of spectacle, much like the Siofra River itself. Having said all that, my favorite moment in the Siofra River actually concerned the lonely merchant who plays music here. His somber string piece echoing off the walls gave me that feeling that I have when I encounter many NPCs, that the loneliness of the world is too big and too imposing to ignore, and really no one survives it forever. He seems genuinely surprised to find anyone down here with him. For some absurd reason, I fought the Dragon-Skin Soldier before the Ancestor Spirit. This fight occurs multiple times as well, and the Dragon-Skin Soldier, once a strategy has been discovered, is not too difficult. The player can stick behind him and to the right, against his strong side. This prevents the giant from getting a grip on the player. Torrent is able to ride out and away from the giant, thus luring it into overextending, if it can be managed. It can be a very difficult fight if a player has not prepared with some sort of upgraded weapon or heavy investment in skills, as the defenses of the Dragon-Skin Soldier are quite high. I don't mind this fight as much as others because of the wide berth I'm allowed to tackle this enemy in my own way. The America Scar Seal he is guarding is not effective for our Vagabond, but is somewhat effective for our Astrologer, as the bonus attributes line up well with her. The 10% damage uptick does hurt, but with her we are already in a precarious position, as we should be striving not to be hit at all. I wish I could say the same thing about the boss fight for the Ancestor Spirit. Because the player does not have access to Torrent, and because the spirit finds itself in the air often, and because the legs of the spirit are taller than the player, the fight feels very unwieldy. The spirit rests in that category of bosses in Elden Ring that leave very few chances for the player to attack. Unlike other bosses, hit trading is minimal, but instead the boss feels like a boss to watch, rather than actually fight. It is a beautiful scene, don't get me wrong, but its presence in the world doesn't hold a candle to the great grey wolf Sif from Dark Souls. After the power of the visuals wear off, much of Siofra is running around erratically avoiding bulls, lighting lanterns, dodging electric balls, and grabbing items hastily. While that is going on, we can perhaps speculate on what a completionist playthrough might feel like in Elden Ring. One question has stunned me. Is a player expected to kill every enemy in the overworld at least once? I thought about this question when thinking about how exactly to do a commentary. It didn't make sense to do a commentary on only the required pieces of content in Elden Ring, because that is entirely too little. But to showcase every little detail would invite the problems of repetition that we will see as we go along. One playthrough did not make sense for Elden Ring, a game which maximizes choice above all else, not to mention that the diversity of playable builds was one of Elden Ring's biggest selling points in their marketing. Another point to mention is these enemies that dot the landscape. In previous Dark Souls games, either running through entirely or taking each on methodically were two strategies that occasionally mixed. I have previously mentioned the pathetically low number of runes of killing enemies compared to simply collecting golden runes. If a player were to slowly and methodically collect every item and kill every enemy in each location of Elden Ring, one of the things we could speculate on is just how much of a difference in levels we might expect that to be. Beyond level 40, it takes over 10,000 souls to increase in level. Supposing a player were to kill these ancestors following in a Siofra River, they reward around 182 runes, which is still no comparison to simply collecting a golden rune of 200. So no, I have to conclude that many enemies exist in the overworld, and they're meant to connote a feeling rather than as an opportunity for combat. Stormveil is the second location in our journey so far, after Castle Morn, to feel like a tried and true Souls experience. The verticality of Stormveil is beyond what we've seen thus far. The movements up and down the several layers of the castle reminds us of the Cathedral of the Deep from Dark Souls 3, the Undead Burg, Undead Parish, and Undead Depths from Dark Souls 1. And at the end we fight Godric, what the game knows as the runt of the litter of Marika's offspring. Much like the twin gargoyles and the first Bell of Awakening, a lot happens to the lands between and to the player in a narrative way after Godric's death. Again, this is a commentary, not a walkthrough, so I won't speak to every facet of Stormveil. And as you'll see, my vagabond, as thorough as he's been, does not touch every corner of Stormveil either. We enter Stormveil to see it heavily guarded, and gatekeeper Gostok warns us of impending disaster if we choose the front entrance. He recommends instead a side passage to go around Stormveil. Gostok is an NPC who can be heard slinking around the player and can apparently steal runes acquired from fights the player has in Stormveil. There is a way to confront Gostok on this, which does not happen to me. It is quite a bizarre thing to do to the player, but I honestly don't mind. Any sort of narrative variety from NPCs will almost always be appreciated by me, even ways that may hurt the player. Our first steps through the side passages will have us facing these annoying birds with metal skis on their legs. For our vagabond strength character, these enemies are hell on earth. We do have a ballista, but we have limited bolts for it, which means we have to use them with discretion, even with the reach of the claymore. The moveset of the sword lacks the kind of upswinging that we need to go after these birds. For our astrologer, these birds have no escape. Surprisingly soon after, we find a site of grace as the cliffside. In my mind, though Stormveil has 6 sites of grace, it really should have only 2 sites of grace and a stake of America. Some of these sites of grace will hardly be used. This first one into the castle proper will be short-lived before the Rampart Tower. The Rampart Tower has several shortcuts, but will be superseded by the liftside chamber. I think that careful work should have been done to merge the Stormveil Cliffside and Rampart Tower to create a complex method for levels 1 and 3, while liftside chambers should have handled everything for levels 2 and 0, if that makes sense. When I speak of the 0 floor, I am referring to the bottommost depths where we will find the ulcerated tree spirit, and whatever the highest tops of the ramparts are, those would go to the 3rd floor. I think a stake of America could have been used rather than a site of grace for the secluded cell before Godric, and obviously the Stormveil main gate and the Limgrave Tower Bridge could have been combined. Or perhaps the Stormveil main gate needed to not have a site of grace at all, but could have been a shortcut if the enemies guarding the main gate could have been permanently removed after being killed, which the Soul games will occasionally do. Keep in mind that every site of grace means that a player can fast travel out into whatever part of the world they wish and return to Stormveil. At no point in Elden Ring will there ever be the same feeling as a player had in Blighttown in Dark Souls, where the world seems so intimidating and a player is at the first third of their journey and they feel lonely and lost. Also keep in mind that Elden Ring has yet to really push the player, excepting perhaps Castle Morn, in a way that shows grit, or restraint, or knowable patience. Most of Elden Ring simply does not play like Dark Souls. Sure, in some ways, Elden Ring is Dark Souls 4, in the minutiae of its combat. But when we speak towards the feeling in Dark Souls of having a body, one that cannot fast travel, and taking that body all through a large portion of the game, at least before the Lord Vessel, then we have to concede that there was an intention to embedding the player in those predicaments. It was a risk, but I believe it paid off. In Elden Ring, a player is often not far from safety, either the safety of another site of grace, safety from the open world with Torrent, safety with the Round Table Hold, or just safety with Stakes of America. I have less negative feelings towards the proximity of sites of grace than I do with the fast travel option that connects what I feel could have been separate. Gatekeeper Gostok will lock the player into a room with a banished knight, and the darkness can be dangerous for a new player. Fortunately for our vagabond, this is the kind of ambush that he relishes. With heavy armor, a 100% block shield, and a claymore, this is a difficult fight to mess up. Once we pick up the rusty key, we can continue through Stormveil. This is a far different fight for our mage, who is locked in against a knight with a big reach, and she will go down all too quickly. Many of these earlier areas in Stormveil are more questions of positioning than fights. Commoners will throw explosive pots onto fire barrels which can have huge secondary explosions. Ambushing commoners can cause the player to fall in between the rafters. So these are not necessarily the skills it will take to fight Godric that are being prepared, but these are skills more of observation and careful attention. If this feels like a different game than the one we've been playing, that's because it is. Legacy dungeons have been grafted onto Elden Ring's open world. To me, the Souls games have always been open world, quote unquote, though I suppose when people say that name they are referring to a very precise and narrow definition. of the kind we see in many premium AAA game titles from developers in the console space. What set them apart was the complex way in which the open world interacted with itself, namely that way in which each area felt labyrinthine and codependent. There were multiple pathways to New Londo ruins, for example, or multiple pathways from Firelink Shrine, each of them viable depending on what a player wanted to do. These are still sort of here in Elden Ring, but they are placed in the context of a massive canvas that feels decidedly less like a Souls game because the combat mechanics of the game are designed for a profoundly close-range experience. Once a player makes it further up the ramparts, there are continued cases where a player can be surprised by commoner enemies in hidden spots, but besides that, the moving up the rafters to the top of the rampart tower sites of Grace has one larger enemy, a patrolling knight, who can easily be snuck past. Compared to the distance between checkpoints in the Undead Burg, or between the first shortcuts of Yharnam and Bloodborne, and Stormveil is shockingly easy. The commoner enemies do not group up like the mad enemies on the streets of Yharnam, and the composition of more difficult enemies are far fewer. What is appreciated about Stormveil, perhaps compared to either the Undead Burg or Yharnam, is its verticality without profoundly long ladder climbs. Stormveil is wonderfully large and imposing for an early player. A player may see in the Rampart Tower that an elevator shortcut awaits them. Shortcuts in dungeons are FromSoftware's bread and butter. And besides these easy shortcuts we have seen in Catacombs, or in the rather obvious teleportation mechanics in Tombs, where we are simply sent back to the beginning, this may be the first time in the game we have been provided a sign of what FromSoftware used to do better than any other developer working in this space. From here, we will see our characters experience two wildly different approaches to Stormveil. Our vagabond will attempt to pick fights that bottle enemies up, and will be uninterested in taking on the entirety of Stormveil. His problems with the flying bird enemies continues to be frustrating, but his stand-up fights against the heavier knights go off without a problem. After some time, the vagabond has gained plenty of levels in strength and vigor, so taking on a grafted scion with the aid of a hand ballista puts this fight far more into the player's hand than before. The Rampart Tower section of Stormveil is perhaps this legacy dungeon's design at its peak. There are several twists and turns, and an early player is apt to be lost in it all. What I think often does not get talked about is the fact that Stormveil actually feels like how a castle would be constructed. There are courtyards and larger expanses, and the main gate continues to several different layers of smaller gates, which feels like how castles were actually designed, with several walled redundancies to allow for multiple points of defense should the outer walls fall. Many rooms, especially the meal hall where a grafted scion is, not only make sense for the functionality of Stormveil, as the place where followers of Godric ate their food, but it also contains with it a story, with environmental storytelling of how the effect of grafting has overtaken the entire castle. Bodies lay strung up nearby, where we'll find the chrysalid memento for Roderica, which can imply that bodies have been thought of not for their whole state, but instead for their most functional parts. Obviously there is a lack of humanity going on, but it's nice to finally see, like Castle Morn, examples of how environmental storytelling have worked well with Souls games' atmosphere and aesthetic. On our approach to Sorcerer Rogier, you will see that, compared to the frustration experienced by our Vagabond, our Astrologer, despite being far underleveled and playing in the overworld for far less total playtime, handles these birds with spells rather easily. Sorcerer Rogier has some resemblance in appearance to Big Hat Logan from Dark Souls. Souls games take a Frankenstein approach to intellectual investigation, meaning that often NPCs in the Souls universe who rigorously explore the depths of knowledge to the expense of all else, be it moral or ethical considerations, often do so at a great cost. Like Frankenstein making his monster, many of these discoveries end up rising up and haunting our characters to bad ends. Sorcerer Rogier continues in that lineage. Later we will hear him talk about the assassination of Godwin and the black knife that did it. For now, all we need to do is simply buy a spell from him to continue his dialogue. Here in this room, as well as the Round Table Hold, there are instances where a gold symbol will appear on the screen to indicate that this place is a non-violent zone, and the player cannot attack. In the past games, this never happened, and players were free to attack all NPCs at all times. FromSoftware would attempt to make NPCs so idiosyncratic in their design, and so odd in how they were placed in the world, that a player would be able to see easily that this is not an enemy, but a narrative event. I suspect they placed one here because a player's nerves are piqued, and dropping into a room is always an anxious thing, because one never knows what one drops into, and as such they are willing to swing at anything and anyone, regardless of if they are a threat or not. After unlocking the shortcut back up to the Rampart Tower, it is here where the paths between the two major playthroughs really begin to diverge. In the Vagabond playthrough, we never head towards the main gate, but instead work our way around the courtyard to the painting room, and then take a back entrance to the lift side chamber, the second best side of Grace in Stormveil for its shortcuts between the bottom of Stormveil, as well as to, eventually, Godric the Grafted. There are several places in Stormveil which neither character will venture, which involve moving around castle tower ledges and rooftops. Instead, in taking an alternate path, our Vagabond comes across several larger armored enemies. Luckily, as long as our Vagabond can pull attention one enemy at a time, we can rely on our levels and gear acquired so far to take them down. Our Astrologer, on the other hand, has paradoxically decided to take Stormveil head-on. The difference comes from the composition of enemies, and although there are many enemies to fight, as well as emplacements, the spell capabilities of our mage makes fighting these light-armored enemies far easier. In fact, I was sort of shocked while recording footage for this commentary at just how easy my mage had it, and over time my mage began to catch up to my Vagabond in levels. As long as the enemy was within range of her spells, the Astrologer could take down enemies with ease. Thanks to the amount of cerulean flasks accumulated at this point, we have enough magic to get us to the lift side chamber checkpoint. The same level of ease occurs in our descent down into the depths of the castle. Our Vagabond has methods of striking the bats at range, like a kukri, so thankfully we have some method of leveraging our lack of ranged options with some kind of initial attack. The Astrologer destroys these bats with single spells. At the bottom of the castle lies the ulcerated tree spirit, the thing that Rogier encountered that perhaps diseased him. Here, both of our characters manage to take him down, though our Astrologer does so far more erratically. We can use the precipitous ladder to return to the top of the castle, but keep in mind that players can simply return to the site of Grace without resorting to doubling back. Although there is a great shortcut to the bottom, should a player die, if a player succeeds in these moments and manages to collect everything, fast travel allows a much faster return. We spend some time performing some last-minute explorations of Stormveil, including collecting yet another golden seed near Godric's fog wall, as well as speaking with Nefeli Lu. Nefeli is a warrior traveling the world, and seems to have come here, disgusted by Godric's desire for grafting. You are free to summon her in the fight with Godric, which I will do on both occasions. The Godric fight is the narrative end to the exposition of the Elden Ring game, and the beginning of the rising action. After the Godric fight, a lot happens narratively, much like the ringing of the bells of awakening in Dark Souls. Like Kingseeker Frampt, the two fingers and its speaker will appear in the back room of the Round Table Hold. Sir Gideon Ofnir will begin to take you seriously, and many of their NPCs turn a corner towards Liurnia. The Godric fight itself is fascinating for a variety of reasons. Summoning Nefeli as well as some Spirit Ashes and fighting Godric is vastly different in difficulty compared to fighting Godric on one's own. Because I am no longer interested in the challenge of fighting bosses in the Souls series, as I have been doing so for almost a decade, and I know the score, you will often see me move through bosses at my leisure. Many of his resistances are relatively minor, other than major bosses we've seen thus far, but his health is higher. He is a democratic boss in that way, where many different player types, excepting perhaps a holy type, will do fine against Godric. And combined with many of these tools in summoning, as well as so much of the world available to plunder before Godric, a player can legitimately grind out a win against him. Unlike perhaps Margit, where exploring the world and returning to him led several players to destroying him in a deflating way, I suspect this is less the case with Godric. As we've seen before, the way runes and leveling up scale, that means a player will likely be at or near level 40, and to attempt to go any higher will likely be difficult to do with grinding, as we have seen how little runes enemies provide. To gain levels in any other way means that a player is likely scouring the world with an attempt to willingly break the game. All the locations between the beginning of the game and Godric do not provide enough substantial runes to break Godric, unless one wanted to spend hours grinding. That grind can be replaced with spirit summons and NPC summons. With the Vagabond, it took me 3 tries to defeat him, same as Father Gascoigne in Bloodborne, though a far shorter number than the twin gargoyles in Dark Souls. Luckily, instead of 2 gargoyles, there's only 1 Godric. Godric's second phase involves grafting a dragon's head onto his arms and spewing fire, a cutscene which invites both disgust and pity. Strangely, the second phase of Godric's fight feels like an easier fight than the first half. I don't know why. With the Astrologer, the fight took only 1 attempt, as the distance provided by spells rests just outside many of Godric's area of effect attacks. Once Godric has been defeated, he provides you with his Great Rune. Great Runes can be charged with rune arcs to bolster the player's stats, but first it must be activated. This is a nice little opportunity for the player to engage those mini quests for the runes that they care about. As this is our first Great Rune of the game, and since it provides a +5 to all our attributes, there is no reason not to pursue it. Like Humanity and Dark Souls, Great Runes remain activated so long as players do not die. But with each death, a subsequent rune arc must be provided. So, in a way, it helps to incentivize survivability over simply causing carnage across the lands between. In contrast to Humanity, Great Runes are yet another way for players to have a choice in what Great Rune they equip, and for what purposes. Each Great Rune presents an opportunity for different types of characters. By the time a player completes the game, their build of whatever type they want to make may look unrecognizable to someone else's. That being said, as we have mentioned before, that does not keep the game from providing certain dominant strategies. Many players may end up using Morgoth's Great Rune later in the game, as it provides a massive benefit to health, which becomes important with later bosses as the player finds themselves simply trading damage with them. Still, in the thesis of Elden Ring in providing choice, I cannot help but admire all the ways where they manage to take a pre-established mechanic and give the player options. As we are nearing the end of this commentary for Part 1, we had better come to terms with what we have seen thus far. First and foremost, the power of having a guided tour of Elden Ring was so enjoyable that I simply have to recommend it for a player's second attempt at Elden Ring. As we go along, I'm going to flirt with the idea that a player could maybe benefit immensely with the Future Press Guide for a player's first attempt at Elden Ring, which to many might come off as sacrilege. When I was young, I played The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask with a dedicated guide, largely because I could not wrap my head around the time mechanic and Clocktown's progression of its plot. That guided tour made me label that game as the best Zelda game, or at least my favorite, which many also might see as a kind of sacrilege. With this guided tour of Elden Ring, I encountered many of the NPCs in the game, felt myself going on a kind of archaeological adventure with my Vagabond, and it felt much less like a Souls game and much more like a storied Canterbury Tales, where I would see NPCs and get a brief glimpse into their world, and there are so many of these NPCs now, and so much for them to say about the world, about the player, and about their intentions, that I would have never encountered blind on first or second or maybe even third playthroughs. Souls games are post-internet in the sense that none of this is intuitive. The locations a player needs to visit and what order are not intuitive. The steps for NPC questlines are not intuitive. The doubling back to locations a player has already visited is not intuitive. The times and places where an enemy appears to fight is not intuitive. All of it is so oppressively opaque because of the size of the open world and the lack of defining moments or features that part of me wants to conclude that using a guide is the way to play Elden Ring. That being said, our mage character managed to use that same guide to complete the same section of the world in a fraction of the time, with an equal or greater amount of power. Many of the NPC questlines will be destroyed besides the one we want, and yet I feel no less bad in this. Collecting runes was a far more rewarding experience than grinding out many of the copy and paste smaller locations. At the end of the day, I suppose, who cares? If a player wants to circumvent this content with collecting items, who are we to impose our intentions on a player who has bought a product and can manipulate it in their own way? I do not think it was an accident that collecting runes and only defeating major bosses places us in a similar leveling space than our completionist Vagabond. Our astrologer is almost more ready for Liurnia than our Vagabond, as the rock sling spell will prove very powerful against Renala, where our Vagabond's overall magic defense leaves plenty to be desired, even with the Spelldrake Talisman. I'm not going to try and cast too much judgment on Elden Ring for this philosophy, as I think you have enough information in this commentary to judge that for yourself. Is it okay for a video game to contain with it the opportunities for its own exploitation? To do so willingly? It's a fascinating question that I think led to many new players getting into Elden Ring and feeling empowered. The Souls games used to be unforgiving. Now we find ourselves with an indulging game. Elden Ring indulges you to break its systems in a way many larger titles would not dare. Whether that is a point of favor or contention, you'll have to decide. One complaint I do have so far with Elden Ring is that its sense of place does not feel as potent in its atmosphere unless a player completes the locations, meeting all of the NPCs. The overworld is absolutely stunning, but unlike its previous games, very rarely does it present a storied atmosphere. Like I said before, when a player enters the Undead Burg or encounters Yharnam, the power of these places involves set pieces like dragons flying in, or a menacing figure on a rooftop shooting a Gatling gun at a hunter. In Elden Ring, we have far more moments tied into very gamey feeling locations, with a boss at the end, and very little to show for it in terms of how the world interacted with the player. I treasure the lack of fast travel in Dark Souls because I truly feel lost in that world. In Elden Ring, feeling lost in the world feels far more implicit, rather than something immediately designed. FromSoftware has so far attempted to make the canvas bigger, rather than use more intricate brushstrokes. I think we have seen an amazing result so far. Limgrave, Weeping Peninsula, and Siofa River are some of the most beautiful spaces of any introduction to their games. In particular, the dynamic environments and their weather, their use of color, their power and scale. It's all jaw-dropping, but there are also a lacking amount of events in that world. That can make the lands between feel paradoxically static and sterile. For most of Part 1, we have to concede that this experience has been a robust and solid one. We have not yet encountered too much repetition in bosses, though we have a little in spaces. We know all about shacks, tombs, and caves, but only a couple enemies like ulcerated tree spirits or Erd Tree burial watchdogs or night cavalry or deathbirds have occurred twice. Margit, Godric, Dragonskin Soldier, and the Ancestor Spirit are all vastly different major boss types that help differentiate in their size and stature compared to the minor bosses we've encountered in smaller dungeons. After Stormveil, our playthroughs will perform some upkeep, including duplicating Godric's remembrance for the purpose of leveling more. The trades for Godric impress neither of our characters, so instead we move on and talk to many NPCs in order to learn more about the demigods, the world, and what it means to claim the Elden Ring. Nefeli Lu returns to the Round Table Hold, and we learn officially that Nefeli is the adopted daughter to Sir Gideon Ofnir. Sorcerer Rogier returns as well, though he is diseased and appears immobile. He speaks to you of his researches and his relationship to Dee, and Dee does the same, implying that the two were firm friends but had a falling out over the concept of death. Fia, upon holding the player yet again, will tell of her acquiring knowledge of the location of the same black knife that Rogier told the player about. She hands the player a map. Roderica and Smithmaster Hugh have talked about making Roderica into a spirit tuner, where we can upgrade our spirit ashes. The envoy to the Two Fingers tells us quite a lot, much like King Seepger Frampt, about our role in the world, about the world in general, and what lies beyond Godric. The voice actor for this old lady is deeply impressive, both for the strangeness of her voice and the way she modulates her voice when she speaks on the Two Fingers' behalf. We have experienced Elden Ring up to Stormveil, and with that we have seen two locations that resemble our previous FromSoftware formula with Castle Morn and Stormveil. We have seen an addition of many more NPCs, each with their own desires, as well as far more dialogue from those like Melina, provided the player has arrived at the right time and place to hear it. We have previously discussed how this is more difficult than ever, as knowing what the correct path is can be difficult to parse out. We have seen some beautiful scenery and scale, but this scale has made it difficult to provide novel gaming experiences, both in geography and in narrative. While we might say that Castle Morn contains what we would call a gaming event in one of these games, this style is not replicated in other areas. Seofor River is one of the several reveals in the game that is worth the price of admission, and although the player can fast travel between sites of grace, atomizing and fragmenting the experience, the feeling of the world designed as it was also meant to compensate for that. The combat of Elden Ring feels, so far, like a refined and coagulated version of their entire history to date, with some stealth and jumping mechanics which work well in the early game. True, some bosses close in on the player a little too well, and some attacks from bosses can either be delayed or have too much spectacle, that they can occasionally be unwieldy, but they are beautiful and filled with the kind of design worthy of their characters in the story and lore. Our vagabond character has reached almost all of the essential locations in an order that feels like a genocidal adventure, while our astrologer is searching for truth in a far more focused and efficient manner, and both came out where we needed them in time for Liurnia of the Lakes, with our vagabond taking 13 hours and our astrologer taking just 3. Our vagabond reached level 45, and our astrologer reached level 41. I hope you have enjoyed part 1 of this commentary series for Elden Ring. I think that Elden Ring is, above all, full of impressions, both from new and veteran players of the series alike. So in that way, unlike some other games, it contains within it the distinct pleasure of having things to talk about. If you did enjoy this, we can look forward to seeing more in part 2, where we discuss Liurnia of the Lakes. Thanks for watching.